They called her Trouble. In every town across the Montana Territory, Clara Jennings brought chaos like storm clouds rolling over the plains. But when that stolen stallion appeared in Blackwater Creek, and the mob surrounded her with ropes and accusations, one cowboy saw something different. Ethan Walker told a lie that would risk everything he'd built, a lie that would either save them both or destroy them. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The August sun beat down on Blackwater Creek with the kind of relentless heat that made men irritable and horses skittish. Clara Jennings had learned to read the signs of trouble the way sailors read storm clouds on the horizon, and as she guided her paint mare down the dusty main street, every instinct she possessed screamed at her to turn around and ride out the way she'd come. But turning around had never been Clara's way. Not when she was 14 and her father was hanged for a crime he didn't commit. Not when she was 16 and her brother Luke disappeared into the lawless territories with a price on his head. And not now, at 23, when she'd finally tracked a lead that might tell her if Luke was alive or dead. The town sprawled before her like a dozen others she'd passed through, false-fronted buildings wearing their prosperity like Sunday clothes, a wide street churned to powder by wagon wheels and cattle drives, and everywhere that peculiar mixture of hope and desperation that characterized the frontier. The Silver Star Saloon stood on one corner, its painted sign already fading under the relentless sun. Across from it, the general store displayed bolts of calico in the window, a promise of civilization in the wilderness. Further down, she could see the sheriff's office, the bank, the hotel, with its second-story balcony overlooking the street. And the people. God, the people were already watching her. Clara had grown accustomed to the stares. A woman traveling alone drew attention the way honey drew flies, but there was something different about these looks. These weren't the usual mixture of curiosity and disapproval she'd learned to ignore. These were harder, sharper, edged with something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. She dismounted in front of the hotel, her legs grateful for solid ground after 8 hours in the saddle. The mare's reins were barely secured to the hitching post when she felt it. That prickle of awareness at the base of her skull that had kept her alive through 3 years of drifting from town to town, always one step ahead of her brother's reputation, always searching for news that never came. That's her. The whisper came from somewhere behind her, but it might as well have been shouted. In a town this size, whispers traveled faster than telegraph wires. You sure? Look at her hair, that red hair. Jennings had red hair. Clara's hand instinctively went to the auburn braid hanging over her shoulder. Her father's hair had been the same shade, catching sunlight like copper wire. In some places, that distinctive color had been a death sentence. Apparently, Blackwater Creek was one of them. She forced herself to move calmly toward the hotel entrance, head high, refusing to show the fear that coiled in her stomach like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. The wooden boards creaked under her boots, dusty leather that had walked too many miles, just like the woman wearing them. Miss Jennings. The voice stopped her cold. Not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. Just her name, spoken with the quiet certainty of a judge pronouncing sentence. Clara turned slowly. The man who'd spoken stood in the street, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, badge catching the afternoon light. Sheriff Thomas Rutherford, according to the telegram she'd seen posted in the last town. 40-something, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life enforcing law in places where law was more suggestion than rule. Sheriff? She kept her voice level, neutral. Can I help you? Depends. Rutherford took a step closer. Behind him, a crowd was gathering, men from the saloon, women from the general store, even a few children drawn by the promise of excitement. You planning on staying long in Blackwater Creek? Just passing through, thought I'd rest my horse, maybe get a hot meal before moving on. Passing through, Rutherford repeated the words like he was tasting them, finding them sour. That's what your brother said too, 3 months back, right before Harold McCaffrey's prize stallion disappeared from his stable. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Luke. He'd been here 3 months ago, which meant, God willing, he'd been alive 3 months ago. I don't know anything about a stolen horse, Sheriff. The lie came easily, smoothly, because it was the truth. Whatever trouble Luke had gotten himself into this time, she'd had no part in it. I'm just looking for information about my brother. If he was here, if anyone knows where he went, Oh, he was here all right. The new voice came from the crowd, and the people parted like the Red Sea to let the speaker through. Harold McCaffrey was everything Clara had learned to despise about men with money and power on the frontier. Tall and broad, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that assessed everything in terms of ownership and value. He wore his wealth in tailored clothes that wouldn't have looked out of place in San Francisco, and his hand rested on a gun belt that was more ornament than tool. Mr. McCaffrey. Rutherford's tone held a note of deference that made Clara's jaw tighten. Maybe we should handle this in my office. Why? McCaffrey's gaze never left Clara's face. Everyone in this town knows what happened. Luke Jennings stole my stallion, Midnight King, worth more than this girl's whole family probably made in a lifetime. He rode out on that horse, and I haven't seen either of them since. He took a step forward, and Clara noticed several ranch hands moving to flank him. Now, here comes his sister, pretty as you please, riding into town like she owns the place. You trying to tell me that's coincidence? I'm trying to tell you I don't know anything about your horse. Clara held her ground, even though every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to run. I haven't seen my brother in 3 years. I'm just trying to find him. Convenient story. McCaffrey smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Real convenient, showing up right when I've got buyers coming in from Denver to look at my breeding stock. You and your brother working together? He steals my best stud, you come back to scout out what else might be worth taking. That's not... Clara started, but the crowd's muttering drowned her out. Jennings' family always was trouble. Bad blood runs deep. Should have known better than to trust that boy. The accusations swirled around her like dust devils, and Clara felt the familiar trap closing. It didn't matter what she said. Didn't matter that she'd had nothing to do with whatever Luke had done. The Jennings name was poison, and she'd been fool enough to think one more town might be different. Sheriff, McCaffrey's voice cut through the noise like a knife. I'm formally accusing this woman of conspiracy to commit theft. I want her held until we can sort out what she knows about my stallion's whereabouts. Now hold on. Rutherford shifted uncomfortably. Mr. McCaffrey, we can't just arrest someone without evidence. The evidence is her name. Her brother's a known thief, and she admitted she's looking for him. That's enough for me to demand she be held for questioning. Clara's hand moved toward the small pistol tucked in her belt. Not to draw it, just a reflexive gesture that spoke to 3 years of learning to defend herself. But that small movement was all McCaffrey needed. She's armed! His shout rang out across the street. Sheriff, she's reaching for a weapon! Everything happened at once. Rutherford's hand went to his own gun. The crowd scattered, people diving for cover behind water troughs and hitching posts. Clara found herself staring down the barrel of the sheriff's Colt, her hands instinctively rising, the gesture of surrender she'd sworn she'd never make again. Don't. Rutherford's voice was steady, but there was regret in his eyes. Don't make this worse, Miss Jennings. Just keep your hands where I can see them. I wasn't... Clara's voice cracked, anger and fear and 3 years of exhaustion finally breaking through. God damn it, I wasn't drawing on you. I was just reaching for your gun, McCaffrey finished, satisfaction dripping from every word. In front of 30 witnesses. Sheriff, I think we've got all the evidence we need to hold her. Clara looked at the faces surrounding her. No sympathy there, no benefit of the doubt. Just the same judgment she'd seen in a dozen other towns. The same assumption that her father's shame was her inheritance, that her brother's crimes were her responsibility. She was so focused on the crowd, on McCaffrey's triumphant smile and Rutherford's reluctant duty, that she almost didn't notice the man who stepped forward from the shadow of the Silver Star Saloon. That's not what happened. The voice was quiet, but it carried. Something in its calm certainty made people turn, made even McCaffrey pause in his moment of victory. The man who spoke was tall, a few inches over 6 feet, with the lean, weather-hardened build of someone who worked cattle for a living rather than just owning them. His clothes were practical workwear, denim and leather worn soft with use, and his hat was pushed back to reveal sun-streaked brown hair and eyes the color of a Montana sky just before sunset. But it was his face that caught Clara's attention, strong-featured and serious, with the kind of quiet integrity that made lies visible by contrast. Ethan. Rutherford lowered his gun slightly, confusion replacing the resignation in his expression. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that Miss Jennings couldn't have been conspiring with her brother to steal anything. The man, Ethan, moved further into the street with the easy confidence of someone who knew his place in this town and wasn't afraid to use it. She was at my ranch all day. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hot wind seemed to hold its breath. What? McCaffrey's face darkened. That's impossible. She just rode into town. She just rode into town from my ranch, Ethan corrected, his tone never changing from that same calm reasonableness. The Double W, 5 miles west. She arrived around dawn, looking for information about her brother. I gave her coffee, answered what questions I could, and sent her on her way a few hours ago. He looked directly at Clara, and something in his steady gaze told her to stay quiet and let him talk. So unless you're accusing me of lying, Sheriff, I think we can agree that Miss Jennings hasn't had time to conspire with anyone about anything. Clara's mind raced. She'd never seen this man before in her life. She'd certainly never been to his ranch. She'd ridden straight through from the last town, sleeping rough in the hills outside Blackwater Creek before gathering the courage to ride in. Everything he was saying was a complete fabrication, and yet he said it with such conviction, such quiet certainty, that even she almost believed him. Ethan Walker. McCaffrey practically spat the name. I should have known you'd stick your nose into this. Always did have a soft spot for strays and lost causes. I have a soft spot for the truth, Ethan replied evenly. And the truth is, you've got no grounds to arrest this woman. She's guilty of nothing more than having an unfortunate family name. The hell she's not. McCaffrey's composure cracked. Her brother stole from me. She comes looking for him. That's conspiracy. That's concern. Ethan turned to face the rancher fully now, and Clara saw several men in the crowd nod slightly, silent support for whatever stand he was making. A sister worried about her brother. Nothing illegal about that, last I checked. Rutherford holstered his gun, looking between the two men with the wary expression of someone caught between a rock and a hard place. Mr. McCaffrey, if Ethan says she was at his ranch, then she's got an alibi for whatever you think she was planning. An alibi provided by a man who's been challenging my water rights for the past 6 months, McCaffrey's voice rose. This is convenient timing, Walker. Real convenient. The timing is what it is. Ethan's voice stayed level. And unless you've got actual evidence of a crime, not just suspicions based on who her brother is, I suggest we all go about our business and let Miss Jennings do the same. For a long moment, Clara thought McCaffrey might actually throw a punch. His face flushed dark red, his hands clenched into fists, and the ranch hands behind him tensed like dogs waiting for the signal to attack. But Rutherford stepped between them, one hand raised. Mr. McCaffrey, Ethan's right. We can't arrest someone without evidence. If Miss Jennings was at his ranch like he says, then she couldn't have been planning anything with her brother. He turned to Clara, and she saw both warning and sympathy in his eyes. That said, Miss Jennings, I'm going to suggest you don't stay in Blackwater Creek any longer than necessary. Feelings are running high about your brother's actions, and I can't guarantee your safety if things get heated. It was the kindest way possible of telling her to get the hell out of town. Clara should have been grateful. Should have taken the warning, mounted her horse, and ridden out before the sunset that was starting to paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the way this stranger, this Ethan Walker, had stepped forward when he had no reason to. Maybe it was the desperate need to know what had happened to Luke. Or maybe it was just 3 years of running, 3 years of being judged for crimes she hadn't committed, finally reaching their breaking point. Sheriff? Her voice sounded stronger than she felt. I appreciate the advice, but I'm not leaving until I get some answers about my brother. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just here to find out if he's alive or dead. He's alive, McCaffrey said, and the venom in his voice made it clear he considered that a tragedy. Saw him riding north on my stallion not 3 weeks ago. Recognized that red hair even from a distance. He smiled coldly at Clara. So now you know. Your brother's a thief and he's out there somewhere, probably selling my horse to the highest bidder. You got your answer. Now get out of my town before I find a way to make those conspiracy charges stick. Clara's heart, which had been hammering with fear and adrenaline, suddenly soared. Alive. Luke was alive. 3 weeks ago, which meant the trail wasn't completely cold. If she could just... Miss Jennings, Ethan Walker's voice cut through her racing thoughts. I think maybe you and I should finish that conversation we were having about your brother. He looked at her meaningfully, and Clara understood that he was offering her a way out, a reason to leave town with him, away from McCaffrey's anger and the crowd's judgment. You didn't get a chance to look at those old property maps I mentioned, the ones that show the northern trails. It was an obvious fiction, a thin excuse that wouldn't fool anyone who thought about it for more than a second. But it was also a lifeline, and Clara had learned to grab those when they were offered. Yes, she forced herself to sound calm. Yes, that would be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Walker. Ethan. He moved to where her mare stood at the hitching post, untying the reins with the easy competence of someone who'd handled horses all his life. And you don't need to thank me for common decency, Miss Jennings. Clara. She took the reins from him, their fingers brushing briefly. His hands were calloused, work-hardened, warm, and I think we both know what you just did went beyond common decency. Something flickered in those blue eyes. Amusement, maybe, or acknowledgement of the lie they were both now committed to. My ranch is 5 miles west. Follow the creek road and you can't miss it. I'll ride ahead and make sure the maps are ready. He swung up onto a sorrel gelding that had been waiting patiently in the saloon's shade, then looked down at McCaffrey. Harold, I'm sure the sheriff will let you know if there are any developments in the case of your missing stallion. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you kept your accusations factual rather than theatrical. McCaffrey's face went from red to purple. This isn't over, Walker. I didn't think it would be. Ethan touched his hat brim, a gesture that could have been respect or mockery, and urged his horse into an easy trot down the main street. Clara didn't wait for permission to follow. She mounted her paint mare and fell in behind him, acutely aware of every eye on her back, every whispered curse and speculation. But none of it mattered as much as the fact that she was riding away from that confrontation with her freedom intact and new information burning in her mind. Luke was alive. 3 weeks ago, heading north. And this stranger who'd just saved her from arrest, or worse, knew something, had to know something. Why else would he have lied so convincingly on her behalf? They rode in silence until the town was a half-mile behind them, and the creek road wound into hills covered with pine and scrub oak. Only then did Ethan slow his gelding to a walk and glance back at her. You handle yourself well under pressure. Clara studied him warily. You make a habit of lying to sheriffs for women you've never met? Not generally, no. A hint of a smile touched his mouth. But I also don't make a habit of watching innocent people get railroaded by men like Harold McCaffrey. You don't know I'm innocent. Don't I? He met her gaze directly. I've seen guilty people, Clara Jennings. You're not one of them. Desperate, maybe. Scared. Running from something. But not guilty. The accuracy of his assessment made her defensive. What makes you such an expert? Experience. The smile faded. I spent 2 years as a deputy in Texas before I came north. Saw plenty of people accused of crimes they didn't commit, usually because someone with money and influence decided they made a convenient scapegoat. He nodded back toward town. McCaffrey's been doing that since he arrived in Blackwater Creek 5 years ago. The man sees himself as some kind of frontier baron, and anyone who challenges him or inconveniences him becomes an enemy. And you challenge him. It wasn't a question. Our ranches share a creek. I won't let him dam it up to fill his fancy irrigation system while my cattle go thirsty. That makes me an enemy. Ethan shrugged. But that's my problem, not yours. Your problem is that your brother really did steal his horse. Clara's brief sense of gratitude evaporated. You don't know that. I do, actually. Ethan pulled his horse to a stop and turned in the saddle to face her fully. Because Luke Jennings showed up at my ranch 6 weeks ago with that stallion. Midnight King. Beautiful animal. 16 hands of pure black thoroughbred, probably worth every penny, McCaffrey claimed. He paused. He also showed up with a bullet in his shoulder and a story about being framed for a crime he didn't commit. The world seemed to tilt sideways. What? Your brother's at my ranch, Clara. Has been for the past 6 weeks, healing up and hiding out. That's why I stepped in back there, because I knew damn well you weren't conspiring with him when he's been unconscious with fever for most of the past month. Ethan's expression was serious now, almost grave. And because when I asked him if there was anyone who might come looking for him, anyone who should know he was alive, he mentioned a sister with red hair who'd been searching for him since the day he left home. Clara's throat closed up. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, finding Luke, learning he was safe, but never like this. Never with a stranger's quiet revelation on a dusty road while her heart hammered against her ribs. "He's alive," she whispered. "He's really alive." "He's alive, still weak, but getting stronger every day." Ethan hesitated. "Clara, there's more you need to know before we get to the ranch. About what happened, about why he took that horse. But maybe you should see him first. Make sure for yourself that he's all right." She nodded, not trusting her voice. 3 years. 3 years of traveling from town to town, following rumors and dead-end leads, always wondering if the next bit of news would be word that her baby brother had been hanged or shot or frozen to death in some mountain pass. And now, impossibly, he was 5 miles away, alive and healing. The relief was so intense it almost hurt. They rode the rest of the way in silence, climbing into hills that grew greener as they followed the creek upstream. The Double W Ranch revealed itself gradually. First the fences, well-maintained and straight, then the pastures where cattle grazed on good grass, and finally the buildings themselves. It wasn't the biggest ranch Clara had seen, but everything about it spoke of care and pride and ownership. The barn was freshly painted, the corral fences solid, and the main house, though modest, looked like it had been built by someone who intended it to stand for generations. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a dog, some mix of shepherd and wolf, came bounding out to greet them with tail-wagging enthusiasm. "Easy, Duke." Ethan dismounted and rubbed the dog's ears. "We've got company." A woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was somewhere in her 50s, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a bun, and the kind of face that could shift from stern to warm in an instant. Right now, she looked puzzled. "Ethan? Who's this?" "Mrs. Chen, this is Clara Jennings, Luke's sister." Ethan helped Clara dismount, his hand briefly steadying her elbow. "Clara, this is Mrs. Chen. She's been helping take care of your brother." The woman's expression transformed into something like joy. "Oh, thank the Lord. He's been so worried about you, asking if anyone had seen you, if there had been any news." She hurried forward and took Clara's hands in her own work-roughened ones. "He's inside, dear. Just finished eating some broth. He'll be so glad to see you." Clara found herself being pulled toward the house, Mrs. Chen chattering about how Luke had been improving, how his fever had finally broken last week, how he was starting to sit up and take notice. But Clara barely heard the words. All her attention was fixed on the doorway ahead, on the knowledge that beyond it, her brother waited. The interior of the house was simply furnished but clean, with the kind of touches that spoke of a woman's influence. Curtains on the windows, a rag rug on the floor, wildflowers in a jar on the table. A hallway led to what must be bedrooms, and it was toward one of these that Mrs. Chen guided her. "He tires easily still," the older woman cautioned. "Don't be alarmed by how thin he is. We're building him back up." Then she opened the door, and Clara saw him. Luke sat propped against pillows in a narrow bed, his left shoulder bandaged, his face gaunt and pale, but undeniably alive. His red hair, the same shade as her own, had grown long and was pulled back in a rough tie. He'd been a boy when she last saw him, 17 and reckless and full of anger at a world that had hanged their father for another man's crime. Now he was a man, 20 years old and marked by whatever he'd survived in the years between. But his eyes, those same green eyes he'd inherited from their mother, widened with recognition and disbelief. "Clara?" His voice cracked. "God damn, Clara! Is that really you?" She was across the room before she knew she'd moved, falling to her knees beside the bed and gripping his good hand in both of hers. "You idiot! You absolute idiot! Do you have any idea how long I've been looking for you?" 3 years, give or take. Luke's laugh turned into a cough, and Mrs. Chen was there instantly with water. When he could speak again, his eyes were wet. "I'm sorry. God, Clara, I'm so sorry. I wanted to write, wanted to find you, but everywhere I went there were bounty hunters, or sheriffs, or..."
He trailed off. It wasn't safe for either of us. I don't care about safe. Clara's own eyes were stinging. I care about knowing you're alive. That's all I've cared about for 3 years.
They held each other, or as close to it as they could manage with his injured shoulder, and Clara let herself cry for the first time since the day Luke had disappeared. All the fear, all the loneliness, all the desperate hope that had driven her from town to town, finally releasing in shaking sobs against her brother's neck. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Chen quietly leave the room, murmuring something about giving them privacy. The door clicked shut, and Clara pulled back enough to really look at Luke. What happened? McCaffrey says you stole his horse, and Ethan says you showed up here with a bullet wound. Luke, what the hell have you gotten yourself into? Luke's expression darkened. I didn't steal that horse. I mean, technically I took it without permission, but I had a damn good reason. He shifted against the pillows, wincing. Clara, do you remember the name of the man who actually killed that storekeeper back home? The murder they hanged Pa for? Ned Carver. She'd never forget it. Never forget tracking down the evidence that proved her father's innocence. Evidence that arrived 2 days too late to save him from the noose. Right. Ned Carver. Well, 2 months ago I was working on a ranch over in Wyoming, trying to keep my head down and save some money. And who rides in looking for work but Ned goddamn Carver himself, living under a different name but wearing Pa's pocket watch on a chain? Clara's blood went cold. What? Took it off Pa's body after the hanging, I guess. Thought it was valuable. It's not. Just brass, but it's got Pa's initials engraved inside. I saw it and I knew. Luke's hand clenched into a fist. So I confronted him, told him I knew who he was, what he'd done. Thought maybe I could get him to confess, bring him to justice properly. But he didn't confess. He laughed in my face, said nobody would believe a word I said, that I was the son of a hanged man, and he was a respectable ranch hand with references from Harold McCaffrey himself. Luke's jaw tightened. McCaffrey. That's when I learned that Carver had been working for McCaffrey here in Montana, that McCaffrey had helped him change his identity and get the job in Wyoming. Probably didn't know Carver had killed anyone, but he was protecting him all the same. Jesus, Luke. So I did something stupid. I followed Carver when he rode back to Montana, planning to confront McCaffrey, make him admit he was harboring a murderer. But Carver caught on that I was tailing him. Luke touched his bandaged shoulder. He shot me outside of Blackwater Creek, left me for dead in a ravine. Would have died there too if Ethan hadn't found me. Clara turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, shoulder propped against the frame. She had no idea how long he'd been there. Found him while checking my north fence line, Ethan said quietly. He was more dead than alive, mumbling about Carver and McCaffrey and stolen watches. I got him back here, patched him up as best I could. He pushed off from the doorframe and came into the room. The horse was with him, Midnight King. Beautiful animal, clearly valuable. I figured out pretty quick that McCaffrey would claim it was stolen, use it as an excuse to hunt Luke down and finish what Carver started. So you've been hiding him? Clara looked between them. For 6 weeks. For 6 weeks, Ethan confirmed. And I'd do it again. Because whatever mistakes your brother made, he doesn't deserve to hang for trying to bring his father's real killer to justice. Luke's face twisted with something between gratitude and guilt. I brought that horse here, though. Made you an accessory to theft. If McCaffrey finds out, let me worry about McCaffrey. Ethan's voice was firm. Right now, you need to focus on healing, and your sister needs to hear the rest of it. The rest? Clara felt her brief moment of relief solidifying back into dread. There's more? Ned Carver is dead, Luke said flatly. Died 2 weeks ago in a bunkhouse fire on one of McCaffrey's outlying properties, along with 3 other men who might have been able to testify about what McCaffrey knew and when. The implications hung in the air like gun smoke. Clara sank into the chair beside the bed, her mind racing. You think McCaffrey killed them? His own men? I think McCaffrey is a man who protects his interests, Ethan said carefully, and I think having a known murderer working for him, even unknowingly, could raise questions about his other business dealings. Questions that a territorial investigation might find very interesting. So he cleaned house. Clara felt sick. Burn the evidence. And now he's fixated on finding Luke because your brother is the only person left who can connect Carver to that old murder in... Ethan looked at Luke questioningly. Nebraska, Luke supplied. Little town called Millerton. Nebraska, Ethan repeated. That's why I lied for you today, Clara. Because if McCaffrey had arrested you, he would have used you as bait to draw Luke out. And if Luke had tried to rescue you... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Clara's head was spinning. She'd come to Blackwater Creek looking for information about her brother, expecting at best to find a cold trail and at worst to find a grave. Instead, she'd found Luke alive, found evidence of their father's real killer, and found herself tangled in the schemes of a powerful man who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect his reputation. What do we do? She asked finally, looking at Ethan. Luke's too weak to travel, and even if he wasn't, McCaffrey saw me in town. He knows the Jennings family is still around. He'll be watching for any sign of Luke. We sit tight, Ethan said. Let Luke finish healing. Meanwhile, I've got friends, men who work for me, men who owe McCaffrey no loyalty, who can keep an eye on his movements. If he makes a move toward this ranch, we'll know about it. And then what, we run? Clara shook her head. I'm tired of running, Ethan. I've been running for 3 years. Luke's been running longer. When does it end? It ends when we have enough evidence to take to the territorial marshal. Ethan pulled up another chair and sat down, his elbows on his knees, his expression serious. McCaffrey is powerful, but he's not untouchable. If we can prove he knowingly harbored a murderer, if we can connect him to that bunkhouse fire, if we can show a pattern of criminal activity, then even his money and influence won't save him. That's a lot of ifs, Luke pointed out. It is, Ethan agreed. But it's better than the alternatives, which are either running forever or shooting it out with McCaffrey's men and hoping we survive. Silence fell over the room. Outside, Clara could hear the normal sounds of a working ranch, cattle lowing, a horse whinnying, the distant ring of a hammer on metal. Simple sounds of simple work, the kind of life she'd once imagined having before her father's death had shattered that dream. Why? She asked quietly. Why are you doing this? You don't know us. This isn't your fight. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if seeing something beyond the walls of the room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. 6 months ago, I was caught in a blizzard in the high country. Worst storm I've ever seen. The kind that freezes you solid before you even realize you're in trouble. My horse broke a leg, and I was 3 miles from any shelter. I should have died out there. He looked at Clara directly. I prayed that night. First time I'd prayed since I was a boy. Asked God why he'd spared me so far, what I was supposed to do with this life I'd been given. And I made a promise that if I survived, I'd pay attention to the answer when it came. And we're the answer? Clara heard the skepticism in her own voice. Maybe. Or maybe the answer is that when I see someone being railroaded by a man with more power than conscience, I don't look away. Maybe it's that simple. Ethan stood, moving toward the door. You two have a lot to talk about. Mrs. Chen will bring dinner in a while. For tonight, just rest. Tomorrow, we'll start figuring out how to prove McCaffrey's guilt and clear Luke's name. He left before Clara could respond, his boots echoing down the hallway. Luke watched him go, then turned to Clara with a weak smile. He's either the best man I've ever met or completely crazy. Maybe both. Clara took her brother's hand again, feeling the bones too prominent under the skin, seeing the shadows under his eyes that spoke of pain and fever and close calls with death. How bad was it, Luke, really? Bad enough that I saw Ma a couple times in the fever dreams. Luke's attempt at humor fell flat. Clara, I'm sorry. For running, for not sending word, for making you worry. I thought I was protecting you by staying away. Thought if people didn't connect us, you'd have a chance at a normal life. A normal life? Clara laughed bitterly. Luke, Pa's execution destroyed any chance I had at normal. Towns that would have welcomed me as a daughter or a sister shut their doors because of our name. Men who might have courted me heard Jennings and remembered the hanging. There was no normal life waiting for me. There was only the search for you. I should have known that. Should have found you somehow. You were 17 years old and terrified. Clara squeezed his hand. We both were.
But we're not anymore, and we're not alone. We've got Ethan and Mrs. Chen and a chance to finally clear our family's name. Not just Pa's name, our name, yours and mine.
Luke's eyes were getting heavy, exhaustion pulling at him despite his obvious desire to keep talking. "Stay," he mumbled. "Don't leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Clara promised. "Not this time. Not ever." She sat with him until he fell asleep, then quietly made her way back to the main room of the house. Mrs. Chen was preparing dinner, venison stew, from the smell, and Ethan sat at the table, examining what looked like a hand-drawn map. "He's sleeping," Clara reported. "You said he's getting stronger?" Every day, Mrs. Chen ladled stew into bowls. 2 weeks ago, he couldn't sit up for more than a few minutes. Now he can stay awake for an hour or two at a time. Give him another month, and he'll be back on his feet properly. A month? Clara sat down across from Ethan. "Will McCaffrey give us a month?" "Hard to say." Ethan pushed the map aside. "He's cautious when he's not sure of his ground. Confronting you in town today was a power play, but he backed off when I gave you an alibi. He'll investigate, probably send some men to watch the ranch, see if your brother shows up. But as long as Luke stays hidden and you stay close, we should be safe enough. Unless someone tells him I'm here. Everyone who works for me knows Luke's story. They won't talk." Ethan's confidence was absolute, and the few neighbors close enough to notice an extra person around are good people who mind their own business. Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in this strange sanctuary that had appeared just when she needed it most. But 3 years on the run had taught her that safety was always temporary, that trouble had a way of finding her no matter how careful she was. As if reading her thoughts, Ethan added, "I know you've got no reason to trust me. But Clara, I meant what I said. This is where I'm supposed to be, doing what I'm supposed to do. I can't explain it better than that. A man of faith." Clara studied him over her stew. "That's rare out here." "Not faith exactly. More like an agreement with God. I keep my promises and I try to do right by people. In return, I get to keep this ranch and the life I've built." He smiled slightly. "Simple terms, but they work for me." They ate in companionable silence, and Clara felt herself relaxing for the first time in days, maybe weeks. The stew was good, the house was warm, and somewhere down the hall her brother slept safely. It wasn't the resolution she'd hoped for. Luke wasn't cleared, they weren't free of danger, but it was more than she'd had this morning. After dinner, Mrs. Chen showed Clara to a small room at the back of the house. "Used to be the hired man's quarters," she explained, "but Ethan's been working alone for the past year. You can stay here as long as you need." The room was simple: a bed, a dresser, a window overlooking the creek, but it felt like luxury compared to the ground beds and cheap hotels Clara had been living in. She thanked Mrs. Chen and was preparing for sleep when a knock came at the door. Ethan stood in the hallway, holding a leather-bound book and looking slightly awkward. "I thought you might want something to read. It's just some poetry. Longfellow mostly, but Mrs. Chen says Luke has been asking for it, and I thought maybe you'd like to read to him tomorrow." Clara took the book, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. For this, and for everything else. I still don't understand why you're helping us, but I'm grateful." "You can pay me back by helping with the ranch work," Ethan said. "I'm a man short since Luke's been laid up, and there's always more work than daylight. If you can ride and aren't afraid of cattle, I could use an extra hand." It wasn't charity, Clara realized. It was dignity, a way for her to contribute, to earn her keep rather than simply accepting help. "I can ride, and I'm not afraid of anything with 4 legs. When do I start?" "Tomorrow, Dawn. Bring gloves if you have them." He tipped his hat and turned to go, then paused. "Clara, what you said in town about not being trouble, you were right. You're not trouble. You're just someone who's had more than her share of it." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing in the doorway with a book of poetry and a strange warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. That night, Clara dreamed of her father's face, not as it had looked on the gallows, but as it had been in better times, smiling over a Sunday dinner or teaching her to ride. And for the first time in 3 years, the dream didn't end with the sound of the trapdoor falling. She woke to birdsong and the smell of coffee, to a new day that held possibility instead of just survival. And somewhere in the house, she could hear her brother coughing, alive, healing, safe for at least one more sunrise. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build on. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of Montana morning that burned off into heat by noon but started with frost on the grass and breath visible in the air. Clara woke to the sound of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. The Double W Ranch. Safety, at least for now. She dressed quickly in the same worn traveling clothes from yesterday. There'd been no time to pack anything else before leaving the last town, and made her way to the kitchen. Mrs. Chen was already there, rolling out biscuit dough with practiced efficiency, and the smell of coffee filled the room like a benediction. "Morning, dear." The older woman didn't look up from her work. "Ethan's already out checking the south pasture. Said to tell you breakfast is on the table, and you should eat before he puts you to work." Clara poured herself coffee and found a plate of eggs and bacon waiting. She ate standing up, too restless to sit, watching through the window as the sky lightened from gray to gold. Somewhere down the hall she could hear Luke's cough, a wet, rattling sound that made her wince. "He's better than he sounds," Mrs. Chen said, reading her concern. "That cough is just his lungs clearing out. Doctor said it's a good sign, actually, means he's healing." "There's a doctor who knows he's here?" "Doc Morrison. Good man. Keeps his mouth shut." Mrs. Chen shaped the last biscuit and slid the pan into the oven. "He's the one who dug that bullet out of your brother's shoulder. Comes by once a week to check on him. Doesn't charge because Ethan helped his son out of some trouble a few years back. You'll learn that about Ethan. He's got friends all over this territory, people who owe him favors or just plain respect him." Clara thought about the way Ethan had faced down McCaffrey yesterday, the quiet authority in his voice. "How long has he owned this ranch?" 5 years, give or take. Bought it from a widow whose husband died in a mining accident. Place was run down, half the fences falling apart, but Ethan saw potential. Mrs. Chen smiled with obvious affection. "He's built it into something good. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but profitable and honest. That matters out here." The door opened and Ethan himself appeared, stamping dust off his boots. He looked like he'd already put in a full day's work, shirt sleeves rolled up, hat pushed back, a smudge of dirt on his jaw. His eyes found Clara immediately. "You ready to work, or you need more time?" Clara drained her coffee and set the cup down firmly. "I'm ready." "Good. We've got about 50 head that need moving from the south pasture to the north. Creek's running low down south, and I want them near better water." He grabbed a biscuit from the cooling rack, earning a swat from Mrs. Chen. "You ever worked cattle before?" "Some. My father had a small ranch before—" She didn't finish the sentence. Before everything fell apart. Before the hanging. Before her life became an endless series of before and afters. Ethan nodded, understanding written in the set of his shoulders. "It's not complicated work, just hot and dusty. We'll take it slow, see how you handle it." They walked out to the barn together, the morning air cool against Clara's face. 2 horses waited in the corral, her paint mare from yesterday and a sturdy bay gelding that Ethan introduced as Copper. "He's steady," Ethan said, tightening the cinch on Copper's saddle. "Won't spook it much, good with cattle. I figured you'd want to save your mare for when you need speed rather than stamina." Clara appreciated the consideration. She'd been riding that paint for 2 years, and the mare had earned some easy days. She swung up onto Copper's back, settling into the worn saddle with the ease of someone who'd grown up on horseback. Ethan mounted his sorrel and led the way south, Duke the dog trotting alongside. They rode in silence for a while, following a creek that sparkled in the early light. Clara found herself studying Ethan, the way he sat his horse like it was an extension of himself, the easy scan of his eyes across the landscape, constantly checking fence lines and water levels and the general state of his land. "You've got questions," he said without looking at her. "Go ahead and ask." "Why'd you really lie for me yesterday?" Clara kept her voice neutral. "And don't tell me it's because you made some promise to God in a blizzard. Men don't risk their reputations on divine inspiration." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Clara thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My younger sister was 19 when she got accused of stealing from the family she worked for in Kansas. She was innocent. Turns out it was the family's son who'd been taking money to pay gambling debts. But by the time the truth came out, Sarah had already been run out of town by people who were supposed to protect her." His jaw tightened. She died that winter, caught pneumonia sleeping rough because no town would take her in once word spread about the theft accusation. Clara's chest constricted. I'm sorry. It was 8 years ago, but when I saw you standing in that street yesterday, surrounded by people ready to condemn you for something your brother supposedly did, all I could see was Sarah. He finally looked at her. So yes, I lied. And I'd do it again. They crested a small hill and the south pasture spread out before them, maybe 40 acres of decent grazing land with a creek running through the middle. The cattle were scattered across it, red and white Herefords mostly, with a few longhorns mixed in. All right, Ethan said, shifting back into work mode. Here's what we're going to do. You take the east side, I'll take the west. We'll push them north slowly, no rushing, or they'll scatter on us. Duke knows what to do, so follow his lead if you're unsure. Clara nodded and peeled off to the east, letting Copper pick his way down the slope. The dog was already moving, weaving through the herd with purposeful intent, and Clara found herself falling into the rhythm of it, calling out to the stragglers, using her horse's bulk to turn the cattle north, working in silent coordination with Ethan on the opposite side. It was hard work, the kind that required constant attention and left no room for worry or fear or the 100 other emotions that had been churning through her since yesterday. The sun climbed higher, the air grew warmer, and sweat started to soak through Clara's shirt, but there was something deeply satisfying about the physicality of it, about working toward a simple, achievable goal. By the time they got the herd into the north pasture and closed the gate behind them, it was past noon and Clara was exhausted in a way that felt clean, honest. Ethan handed her a canteen and she drank gratefully, watching the cattle settle into their new grazing land. You did good, Ethan said. Better than good, actually. You've got instincts for this work. The praise warmed her more than it should have. My father taught me. Before everything went wrong, we had about 80 head. Nothing like the big ranches, but enough to make a living. What happened to them? After your father, Ethan trailed off delicately. Sold at auction to pay his debts, the ranch too. Clara's voice was flat, reciting facts that had long since lost their ability to hurt. Or so she told herself. I used some of the money to hire a lawyer, try to prove Pa's innocence. Rest of it went to keeping Luke and me fed while we tried to find evidence. By the time we proved Ned Carver was the real killer, we had nothing left. No home, no money, no reputation. But you had each other. Until Luke ran. Clara took another drink. He thought if he disappeared, people would stop connecting me to the scandal, stop seeing me as the daughter of a hanged man. He was wrong, but his heart was in the right place. They rode back toward the ranch house in companionable silence, the kind that comes from shared work and mutual understanding. Clara felt herself relaxing in increments, the constant vigilance that had kept her alive for 3 years easing just slightly. Not gone, she wasn't fool enough to think she was safe, but diminished enough that she could breathe without feeling like the air might be poisoned. Mrs. Chen had lunch waiting, cold chicken and fresh bread, and the kind of strong coffee that Clara had learned to appreciate on long trail days. They ate on the porch, watching clouds build over the mountains to the west. Storm coming, Ethan observed. We'll need to bring the rest of the herd in closer before it hits. How many head you running total? Clara asked. About 200, plus a dozen horses and enough chickens that I've lost count. He smiled slightly. It's not the empire that McCaffrey's built, but it's mine. Paid for honestly, worked honestly. McCaffrey. Claire had been trying not to think about the rancher, but his name hung over everything like those building storm clouds. What's his next move going to be? Hard to say. He'll wait, watch, probe for weaknesses. Ethan set down his coffee cup. That's how he operates. He tried to buy this ranch from me 2 years ago, offered me 3 times what it's worth. When I said no, he started filing complaints with the Territorial Land Office, claiming I was squatting on property that should be public grazing. Took me 6 months and most of my savings to prove my deed was legitimate. And the water rights dispute misses. Chen mentioned? That's ongoing. The creek that runs through both our properties, McCaffrey wants to dam it up near the source, says he needs the water for irrigation. But if he does that, my cattle won't have enough water in the dry season. Ethan's expression hardened. He's got lawyers working on it, filing motions in territorial court. I've got the law on my side, prior water rights and all that, But McCaffrey's got money and influence. Sometimes that matters more than the law. Clara heard the frustration beneath his calm tone. You could sell, take his money and start over somewhere else. I could. Ethan met her eyes. But then what? Let him win? Let him think he can just buy or bully his way to whatever he wants? No. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds aren't good. Before Clara could respond, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Two riders came up the road at an easy lope, ranch hands from the look of them, both young men in their 20s wearing work-stained clothes and easy smiles. Boss? The first one, dark-haired with a Mexican accent, tipped his hat. We got the fence repaired on the east section like you asked. Should hold unless we get a real bad storm. Good work, Miguel. Ethan stood. Clara, these are my hands, Miguel Reyes and Tom Fletcher. Boys, this is Clara Jennings. She'll be working with us for a while. Tom, a lanky redhead with sunburned skin, gave Clara a curious look. Jennings, that's the name McCaffrey was spewing about in town yesterday. You the one who stole his horse? Tom. Ethan's voice carried a warning. What? I'm just asking. Tom held up his hands. Heard tell the whole town was in an uproar. McCaffrey saying she was part of some conspiracy. You saying she was here all day. He grinned. Which I know for a fact is bullshit, because I was here all day and didn't see her until just now. That's because she was at the South Line cabin, Ethan said smoothly, checking it for winter supplies, like I asked her to. Miguel and Tom exchanged glances that said they didn't believe a word of it, but were smart enough not to push. Miguel turned to Clara with a slight smile. Welcome to the Double W, senorita. Any enemy of McCaffrey's is a friend of ours. I'm not exactly his enemy, Clara started, but Tom cut her off with a laugh. You're a Jennings. You questioned his authority in public, and Ethan vouched for you. That makes you his enemy 3 times over. He swung down from his horse. But like Miguel said, that just means you're in good company. Over the next hour, Clara learned that Ethan employed 4 full-time hands, Miguel and Tom, plus 2 others named James and Pete, who were out checking the western fence line. All of them lived in a bunkhouse behind the main barn. All of them spoke of Ethan with a mixture of respect and genuine affection, and all of them seemed to know about Luke hiding in the house. Boss saved my life, Miguel said simply when Clara asked why they were so loyal. I got caught in a stampede 3 years ago. Got my leg crushed. Most ranchers would have let me go, said I couldn't work anymore. Ethan paid for the doctor, kept me on wages while I healed, and when I could ride again, gave me my job back. A man doesn't forget that kind of loyalty. Tom's story was different, but similar. He'd been caught stealing food in town, desperate and starving, and Ethan had paid for what he'd taken and offered him work instead of letting the sheriff arrest him. Been working honest ever since, Tom said, and I'd follow the boss into hell if he asked me to. Clara understood then that Ethan hadn't just built a ranch. He'd built something rarer and more valuable. He'd built trust, loyalty, the kind of bonds that couldn't be bought or bullied. It made her both hopeful and afraid, because men like Harold McCaffrey didn't understand loyalty. They only understood power, and they destroyed what they couldn't control. The afternoon was spent on smaller tasks, mending tack, mucking out stalls, the endless maintenance that kept a ranch running. Clara worked alongside Miguel, who treated her like any other hand rather than a woman in need of special consideration. She appreciated that more than she could say. As the sun started its slow descent toward the mountains, Mrs. Chen called them in for supper. The meal was served family style around the big table in the kitchen, beef stew and biscuits and green beans from the garden. Miguel and Tom ate with them, the conversation easy and ranging from cattle prices to the upcoming territorial fair to speculation about when the first snow would hit. Clara listened more than she talked, soaking in the normalcy of it. This was what she'd lost when her father died, this sense of community, of belonging, of being part of something larger than just survival. She'd forgotten what it felt like. After supper, she slipped away to check on Luke. He was awake, propped up with pillows and looking stronger than he had that morning. His color was better, and the shadow of fever had lifted from his eyes. You look like you've been working, he said, taking in her dusty clothes and wind-burned face. Helping with the cattle. Ethan's got me earning my keep. Clara pulled up the chair beside his bed. How are you feeling? Like I got shot and spent 6 weeks recovering. Luke's attempt at humor fell flat. Clara, I've been thinking about what happens next. Even if we prove McCaffrey was protecting Carver, even if we clear my name, what then? We've got no money, no prospects. You can't spend your whole life taking care of your outlaw brother. You're not an outlaw, you're innocent. I stole a horse, Clara. Even if I had good reason, that's still theft. And every bounty hunter and lawman between here and Texas knows my face by now. Luke's voice dropped. Maybe you should go. Head east, start over somewhere they've never heard the name Jennings. Find some decent man, settle down, have the life you deserve. Clara felt her temper flare. You think I rode halfway across Montana territory to find you just so I could abandon you again? You think I spent 3 years sleeping rough and dodging sheriffs and scraping by on nothing just so I could walk away the minute things got complicated? I think you deserve better than this. Luke gestured at himself, at the room, at their entire situation. Better than taking care of a brother who keeps making your life harder. What I deserve, Clara said fiercely, is to decide for myself what my life looks like, and I decide it includes you. We're family, Luke. The only family either of us has left. We stick together. That's what Pa would have wanted. Luke's eyes were suspiciously bright. Pa would have wanted you to be happy. Then he should have raised a daughter who could be happy abandoning her baby brother. Clara softened her tone. We'll figure this out. Ethan's got a plan and he's got resources. We just need time. Time, Luke laughed bitterly. That's the one thing McCaffrey won't give us. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the sound of horses reached them, multiple horses, moving fast. Clara was on her feet instantly, hand going to the pistol at her belt. Through the window, she could see dust rising on the road, and her heart started hammering. Stay here, she told Luke, and stay quiet. She found Ethan already on the porch, Miguel and Tom flanking him. All 3 men were armed, though their weapons remained holstered. The riders approaching were visible now, 6 men in total, riding hard. Leading them was a figure Clara recognized even from a distance. Harold McCaffrey. Inside, Ethan said quietly. Now. Like hell. Clara planted her feet. I'm not hiding. Clara. He already knows I'm here. Running makes me look guilty. She forced her voice steady even as her pulse raced. I face him now, or I face him later. Might as well be now. Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but there was no time. McCaffrey and his men were already thundering into the yard, horses snorting and stamping, dust swirling. The rancher dismounted with the careless confidence of a man who'd never questioned his own authority. Walker, McCaffrey's voice boomed across the yard. We need to talk. Then talk. Ethan stayed on the porch, higher ground, both literally and figuratively. But leave your men outside my property line. This is a peaceful ranch, and I aim to keep it that way. McCaffrey's smile didn't reach his eyes. Peaceful. That's interesting, considering you're harboring a thief and her outlaw brother. I'm harboring a guest who's done nothing wrong. Ethan's tone never changed, but Clara saw his hand drift slightly closer to his gun. Clara Jennings broke no laws, and you've got no evidence to the contrary. Don't I? McCaffrey pulled a folded paper from his coat. This is a warrant, signed by Judge Thompson himself. It authorizes me to search any property where I have reasonable suspicion that my stolen stallion might be hidden. He looked directly at Clara. And I have very reasonable suspicion that your brother and my horse are on this ranch. Clara's blood ran cold, but before she could speak, Ethan did. Let me see that warrant. McCaffrey handed it over with obvious satisfaction. Ethan read it slowly, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he looked up. This warrant authorizes a search of my property by the sheriff. Not by you, Harold. Where's Rutherford? In town, dealing with more important matters. He deputized me for this purpose. McCaffrey's smile widened. Which means I have every legal right to search your ranch, your house, and any outbuildings. So unless you want to be charged with obstruction, I suggest you step aside. The tension in the yard was thick enough to choke on. Clara saw Miguel's hand drift toward his gun, saw Tom shift his weight, preparing for violence. Ethan remained perfectly still, but there was something coiled in his stillness, dangerous. You deputized yourself? Ethan said quietly. Convenient. And this warrant, it's dated today, less than 24 hours after Clara arrived in Blackwater Creek. He handed the paper back. Tell me, Harold, how did you manage to convince Judge Thompson to issue a warrant based purely on your suspicions? What evidence did you present? The evidence of my own eyes. I saw the Jennings girl ride into town. I know her brother stole my horse, and I know you've been acting suspicious for weeks now. McCaffrey tucked the warrant back into his coat. That's more than enough for a search, and you damn well know it. Then search. Ethan's voice carried across the yard. Miguel, Tom, show Mr. McCaffrey's men the barn, the bunkhouse, and the line cabins. Open every door, every stall. Let them look anywhere they want. He paused. Except the main house. That's my private residence, and unless Harold plans to explain to Judge Thompson why he violated a man's home without actual evidence, he'll respect that boundary. McCaffrey's face darkened. That warrant authorizes a search of buildings reasonably suspected of housing stolen property. A horse barn, yes. A bunkhouse where hands might hide contraband, yes. But my private home? Ethan shook his head. That requires more than suspicions, Harold. That requires proof. And we both know you don't have any. For a long moment, Clara thought McCaffrey might push it. His hand hovered near his gun, his men were tense and ready, and the whole situation balanced on the edge of violence. But then, unexpectedly, McCaffrey laughed. You're a clever man, Walker. I'll give you that. He turned to his men. Search the outbuildings, every inch. If that stallion is here, I want to know about it. The next hour was tense beyond measure. Clara watched from the porch as McCaffrey's men tore through the barn, searching stalls and storage rooms and tack areas with thorough brutality. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Ethan had moved the stallion weeks ago, according to what Luke had told her, hidden the animal on a neighboring ranch whose owner owed Ethan a favor. But Clara's relief was tempered by fear. Because even though they didn't find the horse, McCaffrey's men were taking note of everything. The layout of the ranch, the number of hands, the defensive positions. This wasn't just a search. It was reconnaissance. When they finally finished and reassembled in the yard, the lead ranch hand, a hard-faced man with a scar across his cheek, shook his head at McCaffrey. Nothing, boss. If that horse was here, it's gone now. Gone now, McCaffrey repeated the words thoughtfully. Or never here at all. He looked at Ethan with calculation in his eyes. You're good, Walker. Real good. But you're not perfect. You make one mistake, give me one piece of evidence, and I'll bury you so deep you'll never see daylight again. Is that a threat, Harold? It's a promise. McCaffrey swung back onto his horse. This isn't over, not by a long shot. They rode out in a cloud of dust and hostility, leaving behind trampled grass and scattered equipment and the unmistakable sense that war had just been declared. As soon as they were out of sight, Ethan turned to Clara. Get inside. Check on your brother. Make sure he stayed quiet. Clara ran. Luke was where she'd left him, still in bed but sitting up, a pistol in his good hand and murder in his eyes. Tell me he's gone. He's gone. For now. Clara sank into the chair, her legs suddenly weak. Jesus, Luke, that was too close. It's going to get closer. Luke set the gun aside. You heard what he said. He's going to keep coming, keep pushing, until he finds a way to take us down. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Is it safe? For now, Clara told her. But Luke's right. McCaffrey isn't going to stop. They gathered in the kitchen, all of them, even Luke, who insisted on getting out of bed despite his weakness. Ethan laid out a map on the table, marking locations with quick strokes. Here's where we stand, he said without preamble. McCaffrey knows something's going on but can't prove it. He's got a warrant, but it's weak enough that I can challenge it if he overreaches. His next move will be surveillance. He'll have men watching the ranch, looking for any sign of Luke or the stallion. The stallion? Clara looked at him. Where is it? Really? Neighbor's ranch 10 miles west, family named Morrison, the doctor's brother actually. They're keeping Midnight King in their barn, hidden among their own horses. Ethan traced a line on the map. Eventually we'll need to return the animal to McCaffrey, but not until we have leverage. Leverage like what? Miguel asked. Like proof that McCaffrey was knowingly protecting a murderer. that he helped Ned Carver change his identity and get work, possibly even knowing about Carver's past. Ethan looked at Luke. You said you found evidence, Pa's pocket watch, records of Carver's employment. Where is all that now? Luke's face fell. I had it with me when Carver shot me. A saddlebag full of papers, the watch, everything. It fell into the ravine where you found me. He paused. I assumed you'd found it too. I found you and the horse. There was no saddlebag. Ethan's expression was grim, which means either it's still down in that ravine or Carver found it and destroyed it. And if he destroyed it, there's no evidence. Tom's voice was flat. We've got nothing but Luke's word against McCaffrey's reputation. The silence that followed was heavy with defeat. Clara felt it pressing down on her, the weight of 3 years of running, of hoping, of believing that justice was possible if they could just find the right evidence. And now, hearing that the evidence might be gone, destroyed or lost in some ravine. No. The word came out harder than she intended. No, we don't give up. We go to that ravine and we look. Maybe the saddlebag's still there. Maybe Carver missed it in the dark. We have to try. Clara's right. Ethan rolled up the map. Luke, can you describe exactly where you fell? Any landmarks, distinctive features? I can do better than that. I can show you. Luke started to stand, but Mrs. Chen pushed him firmly back into his chair. You'll do no such thing. You're barely healed enough to walk across a room, let alone ride to some ravine. She looked at Ethan, but I can describe it. I've lived in this territory for 30 years, know every canyon and gully within 50 miles. Luke told me the story while he was healing. I can draw you a map. She did exactly that, sketching with quick confidence on the back of Ethan's working map. Here, she said, marking an X. This ravine, about 3 miles northeast of the McCaffrey Ranch, rocky bottom, steep sides, with a lightning-struck pine at the north edge. That's where Luke says he fell. Ethan studied the map, his expression thoughtful. That's uncomfortably close to McCaffrey's property. If we go looking there and his men spot us, then we go at night, Clara said, when his men are either asleep or too busy to notice. Too dangerous. If McCaffrey catches us on his land, that warrant he's got becomes a lot more legitimate. Ethan shook his head. But if someone who wasn't connected to this ranch, someone who had a reason to be traveling through that area, he looked at Clara, and she understood immediately what he was suggesting. You want me to go alone? Not alone. I'll be nearby, watching your back. But you'll be the one actually searching. Ethan's voice was steady, reasonable. If you're caught, you can claim you were just traveling through, looking for a place to camp. A woman alone on the trail. It's believable. And if they don't believe me? Then I step in. Ethan met her eyes. I won't let anything happen to you, Clara. You have my word. It was foolish to trust him. Clara knew that. She'd known this man for barely 24 hours, had no reason to believe he'd keep his promises. No guarantee that he wasn't playing some deeper game. But when she looked at his face, at those steady blue eyes and the set of his jaw and the quiet determination in his expression, she found herself believing anyway. When do we leave? Tomorrow night. That gives us a full day to plan, to make sure McCaffrey's men aren't actively watching the ranch. Ethan turned to Miguel. I need you and Tom to take the cattle to the far pasture tomorrow. Make it look like we're focused on normal ranch work. Pete and James can ride the fence line, keep their eyes open for McCaffrey's scouts. And me? Luke's voice was frustrated. I just sit here and wait? You heal, Ethan said firmly. Because when this is over, when we've got the evidence we need and McCaffrey's been brought to justice, you're going to need your strength to rebuild your life. Both of you. Clara looked at her brother, at his thin face and bandaged shoulder and the anger burning in his eyes. She understood that anger. It was the same fury that had sustained her through 3 years of searching, the same fire that kept her moving when every logical part of her brain said to give up. But fury wasn't enough anymore. They needed evidence, strategy, and most of all, they needed to be smart. Luke, she said quietly, Ethan's right. Let us handle this. You focus on getting strong enough to ride when we need to run. I'm tired of running. So am I. Clara squeezed his hand, but sometimes running is how you survive long enough to fight back. Pa taught us that. Luke's resistance crumbled. He slumped back against his chair, exhausted from even this small exertion. Just promise me something. Promise me that when you do fight back, you hit McCaffrey hard enough that he never gets up again. I promise, Clara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The rest of the evening was spent in preparation. Mrs. Chen packed supplies, dried beef, hard biscuits, canteens of water. Miguel checked Clara's saddle and tack, making sure everything was sound. Tom cleaned and loaded extra pistols, his young face serious with the weight of what they were planning. And Ethan sat with Clara on the porch as the sun set, teaching her the landmarks she'd need to navigate by moonlight, drilling her on what to say if she was caught, making sure she understood the risks. "This ravine," he said, tracing the route on Mrs. Chen's map. "It's steep, but not impossible to climb down. The problem is that once you're in it, you're trapped. Only two ways out, north and south. If McCaffrey's men spot you and block both exits, you'll be caught." "Then I don't get spotted." Clara studied the map, memorizing the details. "How long do I have to search before you pull me out?" "An hour at most. After that, the risk gets too high." Ethan folded the map carefully. "Clara, if you don't find anything in that hour, we let it go. We find another way to fight McCaffrey." "There is no other way, not without evidence." "Then we create evidence. We find other people Carver worked with, other crimes McCaffrey might have committed. There's always another way." His voice was gentle but firm. "I won't have your death on my conscience just to settle a score with Harold McCaffrey." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she'd been risking her life for 3 years and didn't need his protection now. But the words died in her throat because there was something in his expression, a depth of concern that had nothing to do with strategy or justice, and everything to do with her as a person, with Clara Jennings, the woman, rather than Clara Jennings, the convenient ally. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. "Really? Your sister died 8 years ago. You've already saved my brother's life. Why keep risking everything for people you barely know?" Ethan was silent for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and honest in a way that made Clara's chest tighten. 6 months ago, in that blizzard, I was so cold I couldn't feel my hands. So lost I couldn't tell north from south. I knew I was dying, and all I could think was, what a waste. What a goddamn waste of a life. I'd built a successful ranch, sure, made money, earned respect. But I hadn't done anything that mattered, hadn't helped anyone who really needed it, hadn't made a difference beyond my own small corner of the world. He turned to look at her, and in the gathering darkness, his eyes seemed to hold their own light. "Then I found Luke bleeding in that ravine, and you showed up looking for him. And suddenly I had a chance to do something that mattered, to help people who deserved help, to stand up to a man who's used his power to hurt too many innocent folks. So that's why I care, Clara, because you and your brother are my answer to that prayer in the blizzard. You're my chance to make this life mean something more than just survival." Clara had no words for that. No way to respond to such raw honesty, except with honesty of her own. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Scared that we're going to fail. Scared that Luke's going to die, or I'm going to die, or you're going to die trying to help us. Scared that even if we win, even if we clear our names, we'll still be the children of a hanged man, still be marked by that shame." "Then we'll be scared together," Ethan said simply. "And we'll do what needs doing anyway. That's all courage is, Clara, being scared and doing it anyway." They sat in silence after that, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the wind carried the smell of coming rain. Tomorrow night, Clara would ride into danger again, would climb down into that ravine and search for evidence that might not exist, would risk everything on a desperate gamble. But tonight, sitting on this porch beside a man who'd lied to save her, she allowed herself something she hadn't felt in 3 long years. She allowed herself hope. The day that followed felt interminable, stretched thin like wire about to snap. Clara threw herself into ranch work with a desperate energy, trying to keep her mind from circling endlessly around what would happen when darkness fell. She helped Miguel repair fence posts in the east pasture, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every time a rider appeared on the horizon, her hand instinctively moved toward her gun, but it was always just Tom or Pete checking in, reporting no sign of McCaffrey's men. Luke spent the day restless and irritable, pacing the confines of his room like a caged animal, despite Mrs. Chen's orders to rest. Clara checked on him at midday and found him sitting by the window, staring out at the mountains with an expression that broke her heart. "I should be going with you," he said without looking at her. "It's my fight, my mess. You shouldn't have to risk yourself cleaning it up."
It stopped being just your fight the day Pa was hanged. Clara sat on the edge of his bed. This is about all of us now, about clearing the Jennings name once and for all, or dying in the attempt. Luke finally turned to face her. "Clara, if something happens to you tonight, if McCaffrey's men catch you, I won't be able to live with myself. You're all the family I have left." "Then I guess I'd better not get caught." She tried for lightness, but the words fell flat. "Luke, I need you to promise me something. If this goes wrong, if I don't come back, you get out of here. You let Ethan help you disappear, and you build a life somewhere far away from Montana territory. You don't try to avenge me or do anything stupid. You just live. Can you promise me that?" Luke's jaw worked, emotions warring across his face. Finally, he nodded. "I promise. But only if you promise to come back." "I promise to try my damnedest." Clara squeezed his hand and stood. "Get some rest, Mrs.
Chen says you need to keep your strength up." She found Ethan in the barn, checking the shoes on her paint mare. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression told her he'd been thinking about tonight just as much as she had. "How's your brother holding up?" "About as well as can be expected." Clara leaned against a stall door. "He wants to come with us." "Can't allow that. He's too weak, and if something goes wrong, having him there would just make things worse." Ethan set down the mare's hoof and straightened. "But I understand why he wants to. It's hard watching someone else fight your battles." "Is that what you're doing? Fighting our battle?" "I'm fighting for what's right. Sometimes that's the same thing." He moved to the next horse, his hands working with practiced efficiency. "You ever been in a situation where violence was the only way out?" The question surprised her. "Once. 2 years ago, in Wyoming. A drunk cowboy decided he didn't like being told no by a woman traveling alone. Came at me with a knife." Clara's voice was steady, but the memory still carried teeth. "I shot him in the leg. He lived, but barely." "You carry that with you?" "Every day." She met his eyes. "But I carry being alive more. Sometimes survival means doing things that haunt you afterward. That's just the price." Ethan nodded slowly, something like understanding passing between them. "Tonight, if it comes to violence, and I pray to God it doesn't, you let me handle it. You focus on finding that evidence and getting out. Don't be a hero." "I stopped believing in heroes a long time ago." Clara pushed off from the stall door. "But I believe in justice, and I believe that sometimes you have to take it for yourself because nobody else will give it to you." They finished the barn work in silence, the afternoon sun slanting through gaps in the boards and painting everything in shades of gold. Clara found herself memorizing details. The smell of hay and horse, the sound of cattle in the distance, the solid presence of Ethan working beside her. If tonight went wrong, these might be the last peaceful moments she'd ever know. Supper was a subdued affair. Mrs. Chen had made stew again, but nobody seemed to have much appetite. Luke picked at his food. Miguel and Tom exchanged worried glances, and even Duke the dog seemed to sense the tension, lying by the door with his head on his paws and his ears alert. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Ethan stood and addressed the table. "Miguel, Tom, I need you two to stay here tonight. If McCaffrey's men come sniffing around, I want someone to deal with them. Tell them I rode out to check the north pasture, won't be back until morning." "And if they don't believe us?" Tom asked. "Then you make them believe you. You're good at that." Ethan turned to Mrs. Chen. "Keep Luke inside. Keep the lights low. If anything happens, if you hear gunshots or see trouble coming, you get him on a horse and you ride to the Morrison Ranch. Dr. Morrison will know what to do." Mrs. Chen's face was pale, but determined. "We'll be fine. You just bring this girl back safe." "That's the plan." Ethan looked at Clara. "You ready?" She wasn't, not even close, but she nodded anyway. "Let's get this done." They left as the last light faded from the sky, riding northeast with the confidence of people who had every right to be out on their own land. But once they were a mile from the ranch, Ethan led them off the main trail and into rougher country, following paths that only someone who'd lived here for years would know. The moon rose full and bright, turning the landscape into something otherworldly, all silver shadows and sharp edges. Clara's mare picked her way carefully over rocky ground, following Ethan's sorrel with the trust of a horse that knew its rider wouldn't lead it wrong. They rode for what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, climbing into hills that grew steeper and more desolate with each passing mile. Finally, Ethan raised a hand and they stopped. He dismounted and moved to Clara's side, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "We're about half a mile from the ravine. From here on, we go on foot. The horses would just make noise and leave tracks." He pulled a coil of rope from his saddlebag and slung it over his shoulder. "I'll go first. Make sure the area is clear. You stay here until I signal." "How will you signal?" "Owl call. 3 short, 1 long. You hear that? You know it's safe to approach." He handed her a small lantern, the kind with shutters that could direct light in a narrow beam. "Keep this covered until you're down in the ravine. And Clara, if you hear anything that sounds like trouble, you leave. Don't wait for me. Don't try to help. You get back to these horses and you ride like hell for the ranch. Understood? I'm not leaving you behind." "You will if I tell you to." Ethan's voice was hard with command. "This only works if you trust me to know when we're beat. Can you do that?" Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she'd learned long ago not to trust anyone's judgment but her own. But there was something in his expression, a certainty that came from experience and hard-won wisdom, that made her nod. "Good." He checked his gun, then disappeared into the darkness with barely a sound. The waiting was agony. Clara stood with the horses, one hand on her mare's neck for comfort, listening to every snap of twig and rustle of wind. The night was alive with sounds that could be innocent or deadly. The hoot of a real owl, the distant yip of coyotes, the creak of pine branches swaying in the breeze. Minutes stretched like hours, and she found herself counting heartbeats just to have something to focus on. Then it came. 3 short owl calls followed by 1 long. The signal. Clara tied the horses to a sturdy pine and moved forward as quietly as she could, following the path Ethan had taken through rocks and scrub brush. Her eyes had adjusted to the moonlight now, and she could make out the terrain well enough to avoid major obstacles. The ravine appeared suddenly, a dark slash across the landscape, deeper and more treacherous than she'd imagined. Ethan was at the edge, the rope already secured around a boulder. He gestured for her to approach, then pointed down into the darkness. "There," he breathed, barely audible. "See that lightning-struck pine Mrs. Chen mentioned? The ravine runs about 50 yards south from there. Luke said he fell somewhere in that stretch." Clara peered over the edge and felt her stomach drop. The ravine was at least 30 feet deep, the bottom littered with rocks and dead brush. In the moonlight, it looked like the kind of place where broken bones happened easily and death came slow. "I'll lower you down on the rope," Ethan continued. "You'll have 1 hour to search. I'll keep watch up here, and if I see or hear anything suspicious, I'll pull the rope twice. That's your signal to climb back up immediately, whether you found anything or not. And if I can't climb fast enough, then I come down and we fight our way out together." He helped her into a makeshift harness he'd fashioned from the rope. "But it won't come to that. We're going to find what we need and get out clean." Clara wanted to believe him. She tested the harness, found it secure, and positioned herself at the edge of the ravine. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." Ethan's voice was fierce with certainty. "I didn't save your brother just to lose his sister. Now stop talking and start climbing." The descent was harder than she'd expected. The rope bit into her hands even through her gloves, and the rock face was loose and crumbling, sending small avalanches of stones rattling to the bottom. Twice her foot slipped, and she swung free, heart hammering before finding purchase again. But Ethan controlled the rope with steady strength, lowering her in careful increments until her boots finally touched solid ground. She tugged the rope twice to signal she was down, then uncovered the lantern. The narrow beam of light revealed a landscape of shadows, boulders the size of cattle, twisted branches from long-dead trees, and everywhere rocks sharp enough to cut and hidden enough to trip over. Finding a saddlebag in this chaos seemed impossible. But Clara had learned long ago that impossible just meant difficult, and difficult was something she could handle. She started at the base of the lightning-struck pine and worked south methodically, using the lantern to search every crevice and shadow. The ravine smelled of old water and decay, and small animals skittered away from her light, mice or rats or something she didn't want to think about. 15 minutes passed. 20. The rocks all started to look the same, and doubt began creeping in. Maybe Carver had found the saddlebag. Maybe it had been washed away in spring runoff. Maybe Luke's memory of where he'd fallen was wrong, altered by blood loss and pain. Then, wedged between two boulders about 40 yards from where she'd started, she saw it, a corner of leather barely visible beneath a pile of dead brush. Clara's heart leaped. She scrambled over rocks, heedless of scraped knees and torn gloves, and pulled at the brush with frantic hands. The saddlebag came free with a shower of dirt and dead leaves, heavier than she expected. She opened it with shaking fingers and aimed the lantern inside. Papers. Dozens of them. Water-stained, but still legible. Employment records from McCaffrey's ranch showing Ned Carver working under a different name. A letter from McCaffrey himself, referring to our mutual friend who needs a fresh start. Bank receipts showing payments made to Carver over 2 years. And beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from the worst of the weather, her father's pocket watch. Claire's vision blurred with tears. She pulled out the watch and opened it, seeing the inscription inside. To Thomas Jennings, for faithful service, 1865. Her father's name, his identity, proof that he'd been a real person worthy of honor before Ned Carver had killed that storekeeper and let Thomas Jennings hang for it. She clutched the watch to her chest for one brief moment, allowing herself to feel the grief she'd been holding back for 3 years. Then she shoved it and the papers back into the saddlebag, secured the flap, and started back toward the rope. She was halfway there when she heard it, the sound of horses above, multiple riders, and voices carrying in the night air. I'm telling you, I saw a light down in this ravine. Someone's down there. Clara's blood turned to ice. She doused the lantern immediately and pressed herself against the ravine wall, praying the shadows would hide her. Above, she could hear Ethan's voice, calm and unconcerned. Evening, gentlemen. Can I help you with something? Walker. The responding voice was hard with suspicion. One of McCaffrey's men, Clara was certain. What the hell are you doing out here in the middle of the night? Could ask you the same question. This is pretty far from McCaffrey's ranch to be riding patrol. We're tracking trespassers. Someone's been cutting fences, and we've got orders to investigate any suspicious activity. A pause. Like a man alone in the dark near the edge of a ravine. That seems pretty suspicious to me. Clara's mind raced. If they looked down and saw her, or worse, if they found the rope, she was caught. And if she was caught with the saddlebag full of evidence against McCaffrey, she'd likely disappear before morning. She needed to climb out now, while Ethan was distracting them, but moving would make noise. Above, Ethan was still talking, his voice easy and conversational. I'm checking on some cattle that wandered off this afternoon. Thought they might have fallen into this ravine. It's happened before, but I don't see any sign of them, so I was just about to head back. Alone? No hands with you? My hands are back at the ranch, doing the jobs I pay them for. I don't need help tracking a few lost cows. There was a long, tense silence. Clara slowly eased the saddlebag onto her back, securing the strap across her chest so her hands would be free for climbing. She found the rope in the darkness and gave it one gentle tug. Please, Ethan, understand, I need to come up now. The rope moved slightly, and she understood. He'd felt her signal, but he couldn't pull her up. Not with McCaffrey's men watching. She'd have to climb on her own. Clara began pulling herself up, hand over hand, moving as silently as possible. Her arms burned with the effort, and the saddlebag's weight made every movement harder. Below her, rocks she'd dislodged clattered down the ravine wall, and she froze, certain the sound would give her away. But above, Ethan's voice covered it. You boys hear that? Sounded like something moving down there. Could be the cattle after all. Or could be whoever was showing a light down there. One of the men dismounted, and Clara heard his boots approaching the ravine edge. I'm going to take a look. Be my guest, but I'd be careful if I were you. That edge is unstable. Wouldn't want you falling in. Ethan's tone was helpful, almost friendly, but Clara heard the warning beneath it. She climbed faster, ignoring the way the rope bit into her hands, ignoring the pain in her shoulders, and the fear screaming at her to just let go and drop back down into the shadows. 10 feet from the top, she risked a glance up and saw the silhouette of a man peering over the edge, so close she could hear his breathing. Then Ethan was there, right beside the man, positioning himself between the edge and the searcher in a way that seemed casual but effectively blocked his view of the rope. "See anything?" "Too dark to tell." The man stepped back, frustrated. "We'd need to come back in daylight to really search it properly." "Good idea. You do that." Settling in to watch, Clara hung on the rope, muscles screaming, unable to go up or down. She was trapped in the worst possible position, too exposed to weight, too visible to move. Her grip was starting to slip, sweat making her gloves slick despite the cool night air. Then Ethan's voice came again, pitched slightly louder. "Well, since you boys are planning to camp out here, I'll leave you to it. Got to get back to my ranch before my hands start worrying." "You're just leaving? What about your lost cattle?" "They'll turn up or they won't. Not worth losing sleep over." Clara heard him mount his horse, heard the creak of leather and the jingle of harness. "Have a good night, gentlemen. Try not to freeze. Gets cold up here in the small hours." He was leaving, actually leaving, and Clara was still hanging on the rope like a spider on a thread. For one terrible moment she thought he'd abandoned her, left her to fall or climb on her own while he saved himself. Betrayal and fear warred in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Then she felt the rope move. Not up, but sideways. Ethan was dragging it slowly and carefully, pulling her along the ravine wall away from where McCaffrey's men were positioned. It was brilliant and terrifying at once, because if she lost her grip or made a sound, she'd fall 30 feet onto rocks that would break every bone in her body. Clara held on with every ounce of strength she possessed, her boots scrabbling for purchase on the rock face as Ethan pulled her laterally along the ravine. 20 feet. 30. Somewhere above, she heard one of the men say something about checking the other side, and her heart nearly stopped. But then came the sound of horses moving away, and the rope began pulling up as well as sideways. She burst over the edge of the ravine 50 yards from where she'd gone down, gulping air and shaking with exhaustion. Ethan was there immediately, unhooking the harness and pulling her behind a stand of scrub oak. "Don't move," he breathed directly into her ear. "Don't even breathe loud." They crouched in the shadows, so close Clara could feel the warmth of his body, while McCaffrey's men searched the area where the rope had been. She heard them cursing, heard one say he was certain he'd seen something, heard another reply that it was probably just a deer or coyote. The minutes stretched endless and terrifying, and Clara's legs cramped from holding the crouch position, but she didn't dare move. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the men gave up and rode away, their voices fading into the distance. Even then, Ethan made her wait another 15 minutes before he allowed them to move. "They might circle back," he whispered. "We wait until we're sure." When he finally stood and helped Clara to her feet, her legs nearly buckled. The adrenaline that had kept her going was draining away, leaving nothing but exhaustion and delayed terror. She swayed, and Ethan caught her, his hands steady on her arms. "You all right?" "I've got it." Clara pulled the saddlebag off her back and thrust it toward him. "The evidence. Everything Luke said would be there. It's all there. Papers, records, the watch. Enough to prove McCaffrey was protecting Carver, enough to connect him to our father's murder." Ethan took the bag, but his eyes stayed on her face. "You could have fallen. When I pulled that rope, when I moved you along that wall, one slip and you'd have died." "But I didn't slip." Claire's voice was steadier than she felt. "We got what we came for. That's what matters." "That's not—" Ethan cut himself off, jaw working. "Clara, you scared 10 years off my life. When I saw those men coming and you were still down there, when I realized I couldn't pull you up without giving you away—" He stopped, something raw and unguarded flashing across his face. "If something had happened to you, if I'd lost you before we'd even—" He stopped again, seemed to catch himself. "Your brother would never forgive me." "My brother," Claire repeated the words softly. "Is that who you were worried about?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with something neither of them had named yet, but both recognized. Ethan's hands were still on her arms, warm through her sleeves, and the space between them felt suddenly electric. "We should go," he said finally, not answering. Get back to the ranch before McCaffrey's men decide to expand their search. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, retrieving the horses and riding south on paths that avoided any main trail. The saddlebag hung heavy on Clara's back, and with it the weight of everything it represented: justice for her father, freedom for her brother, and a reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. But it was also evidence that would make them targets. Once McCaffrey realized they had proof of his involvement with Carver, he'd do everything in his power to destroy it, and them. The real danger wasn't behind them. It was still ahead, waiting. They rode in silence for the first mile. Then Ethan spoke quietly. "We need to get this evidence to the territorial marshal as soon as possible. There's one stationed in Helena, a man named Jack Morrison, the doctor's cousin, actually. He's honest, can't be bought. Helena's 3 days' ride from here, which is why we leave tomorrow. You, me, and these documents. We get them into Marshal Morrison's hands, make our formal statement, and let the law handle McCaffrey. And Luke stays at the ranch with Miguel and Tom guarding him. It's safer than bringing him along when he's still weak." Ethan glanced at her. "I know you don't want to leave him, but Clara, if all 3 of us are traveling together and McCaffrey's men catch up to us, we've got no chance. This way, at least he's safe at the ranch." Clara knew he was right, but the thought of leaving Luke again, even for a few days, made her chest tight. He's not going to like it. He'll understand, and Mrs. Chen will make sure he doesn't do anything stupid while we're gone. Ethan's voice softened. 3 days there, 1 day to file the charges and give statements, 3 days back. 1 week, and this is over. McCaffrey gets arrested, Luke gets pardoned, and you both get your lives back. It sounded too simple, too easy. But Clara let herself believe it anyway, because the alternative was acknowledging that they might fail, that justice might slip through their fingers one more time, and she couldn't carry that weight tonight. Not after what they'd just survived. The ranch appeared ahead, lights burning in the windows like a beacon. Clara had never been so glad to see any place in her life. They put the horses away quickly, and Ethan secured the saddlebag in his safe, a heavy iron box bolted to his bedroom floor, the kind that would take dynamite or a very determined thief to open. "No one but you and me knows the combination," he said, spinning the lock. "Not even Mrs. Chen. Tomorrow, we'll go through these papers properly, organize them, make copies if we can. But tonight, they're as safe as I can make them." Luke was still awake despite the late hour, pacing his room with barely controlled anxiety. When Clara walked in, he practically lunged at her. "Jesus Christ, Clara, I thought, when you weren't back by midnight, I thought—" He pulled her into a fierce hug despite his injured shoulder. "Don't ever do that to me again." "Can't promise that." Clara held him tight, feeling the rapid hammer of his heart against her chest. "But I can promise you this. We got the evidence. Everything you collected, everything that proves Carver killed that storekeeper and McCaffrey helped him hide. We've got it all." Luke pulled back, his eyes shining. "You're sure? You saw it?" "Saw it, touched it. Have Pa's watch in my pocket right now." Clara pulled out the timepiece and pressed it into his hand. "This belongs to you, to both of us. A reminder of who we're fighting for." Luke opened the watch, read the inscription, and made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "We're really going to clear his name. After all this time, we're actually going to do it. We're going to try." Clara didn't want to promise more than that, didn't want to build hope too high when so much could still go wrong. "Ethan and I are riding to Helena tomorrow to deliver the evidence to the territorial marshal. You're staying here where it's safe." "Like hell I am." Luke's expression turned stubborn. "This is my fight, Clara. I'm the one who tracked Carver, who got shot, who's still too weak to ride 3 days without reopening that shoulder wound." Clara's voice was firm. "Luke, I need you alive and healthy more than I need you with me. Please, stay here. Let us handle this. And when we get back, we'll all go to town together and watch Harold McCaffrey get what's coming to him." Luke wanted to argue. She could see it in every line of his body, but exhaustion and reason won out. He nodded slowly. 1 week? If you're not back in 1 week, I'm coming after you." "Deal." Clara kissed his forehead the way she used to when they were children. "Now get some sleep. You look like death warmed over." She left him there and found Ethan waiting in the hallway, his face shadowed with concern and something else, something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Your brother all right? As all right as he can be, given everything. Clara leaned against the wall, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the narrow hallway forced an intimacy that felt both dangerous and necessary. Thank you. For tonight, for all of it. You saved my life out there. You saved your own life by holding on. Ethan's voice was quiet, intense. I've seen grown men panic and fall in situations less frightening than that. But you just kept climbing, kept fighting. That kind of courage. He stopped, seemed to search for words. That's rare, Clara. Rare and worth protecting. The air between them felt charged, electric with all the things they weren't saying. Clara found herself noticing details she'd been too busy to see before. The way a lock of his hair fell over his forehead, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes reflected the lamplight like still water. I should get some sleep, she said, not moving. Long ride tomorrow. You should, Ethan agreed, also not moving. We'll need to leave by dawn if we want to make good time. Neither of them moved. The house was quiet around them, Mrs. Chen long since gone to bed, Luke finally sleeping down the hall. It would be so easy to close the distance between them, to let exhaustion and relief and something deeper drive her into his arms. So easy, and so incredibly foolish when everything was still uncertain, still dangerous. Clara pushed off from the wall, breaking the moment before it could become something she couldn't take back. Good night, Ethan, and thank you for everything. Good night, Clara. His voice held notes of regret and something else she couldn't quite name. Sleep well? She escaped to her small room and closed the door, leaning against it with her heart racing. This wasn't the time for whatever was growing between them. There'd be time later, after justice was served and danger had passed. Or there wouldn't be time at all, and it would be better not to have started something they couldn't finish. But as she lay in bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the way Ethan had looked at her in that hallway, couldn't stop remembering the fierce protectiveness in his voice when he'd said she was worth protecting. She fell asleep with her father's watch clutched in one hand and hope blooming in her chest like wildflowers after rain. Dawn came too soon, bleeding pink and gold across the eastern sky. Clara woke to Mrs. Chen's gentle knock and the smell of coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. She dressed quickly in her sturdiest traveling clothes and joined Ethan in the kitchen. He'd already packed supplies, bedrolls, food, ammunition, canteens of water. The saddlebag with its precious evidence was secured to his horse, hidden inside an ordinary supply pack that wouldn't draw attention. They ate a quick breakfast while Mrs. Chen fussed and worried, making them promise to be careful, to avoid the main roads, to send word as soon as they reached Helena. Luke appeared just as they were preparing to leave, moving stiffly but under his own power. He pulled Clara aside and spoke in a voice tight with emotion. You come back to me, you hear? I didn't survive getting shot and 6 weeks of fever just to lose you now. I'll come back. Clara hugged him carefully. We both will. And when we do, this nightmare will finally be over. Miguel and Tom were already mounted, prepared to ride the first few miles with them as insurance against ambush. Pete and James would stay at the ranch, guarding Luke and Mrs. Chen. It was the best protection they could manage, but as Clara swung into her saddle and looked back at the ranch house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something precious and fragile behind. Ethan seemed to sense her hesitation. He'll be safe, I promise you that. You can't promise that. None of us can. Clara gathered her reins. But I'm choosing to believe it anyway. They rode out as the sun cleared the mountains, 4 riders moving north with purpose. The morning was cool and clear, perfect traveling weather, but Clara couldn't shake the sense of eyes watching from the hills. McCaffrey would know by now that his men had found nothing at the ravine, would be wondering what Ethan had really been doing out there in the darkness. He'd be watching, waiting, looking for any sign of weakness. And Clara and Ethan were about to give him one by leaving the ranch vulnerable, by splitting their forces and riding into territory where McCaffrey's influence stretched like poison through the water. But there was no other choice. The evidence had to reach the marshal, had to become part of the official record before McCaffrey could find a way to destroy it. Everything depended on the next 3 days, uncovering ground quickly, avoiding trouble, and trusting that justice would finally be served. Miguel and Tom rode with them for 2 hours, then turned back with quiet words of encouragement and clasped hands. Clara watched them go and felt the last threads of safety fall away. Now it was just her and Ethan riding toward Helena with a saddlebag full of explosive evidence and the weight of 3 years' worth of desperate hope. "You ready for this?" Ethan asked as they climbed into rougher country, following trails that would keep them off the main roads. Clara thought about her father's face as they led him to the gallows, thought about Luke bleeding in a ravine, about 3 years of running and hiding and searching, thought about Mrs. Chen's worried face and Miguel's quiet loyalty and the way Ethan had risked everything to help people he barely knew. "I've been ready for 3 years," she said. "Let's go finish this." They rode into the mountains as the sun climbed higher, 2 figures against the vast Montana landscape, carrying justice in a leather bag and prayer in their hearts. Behind them, the ranch held its breath and waited. Ahead, Helena beckoned with the promise of law and order and the reckoning that Harold McCaffrey had escaped for far too long. The storm was coming. Clara could feel it in her bones, in the way the wind shifted and the clouds built over the peaks. But this time, she wasn't running from it. This time, she was riding straight toward the lightning, daring it to strike. And if it did, she'd make damn sure she took Harold McCaffrey down with her. The first day of riding passed in tense silence, broken only by necessary communication about the trail ahead or brief stops to water the horses. They climbed higher into mountain country, where pine forests grew thick and the air turned thin and cold despite the summer season. Ethan led them along paths that seemed more animal track than human road, winding through valleys where creeks ran crystal clear and meadows bloomed with wildflowers that would be gone by September. Clara found herself watching him as they rode, noting the way he constantly scanned their surroundings, the way his hand never strayed far from his rifle, the careful attention he paid to covering their tracks whenever they crossed soft ground. This was a man who'd survived on the frontier not through luck, but through skill and constant vigilance, and she felt safer with him than she had with anyone since her father died. They made camp that evening in a canyon sheltered from wind and hidden from any casual observer. Ethan refused to light a fire despite the cold that crept in with sunset, and they ate a cold supper of dried beef and hard biscuits while the stars emerged overhead in their thousands. "You think McCaffrey knows we left the ranch?" Clara asked quietly, her voice barely carrying across the small space between their bedrolls. "He knows. Question is whether he knows why." Ethan was checking his guns, a ritual Clara had seen him perform every night. If he thinks we're just traveling for supplies or business, he might leave us alone. But if he suspects we've got evidence against him, he'll do everything in his power to stop us from reaching Helena. How would he know? Nobody saw us at that ravine except his men, and they didn't see me. They saw me acting suspicious. They probably found the rope marks on that boulder by now, figured out someone went down into that ravine. It won't take much for McCaffrey to put the pieces together. My unexplained presence, your brother's connection to Carver, the timing of our sudden departure. Ethan set his pistol aside and looked at her directly. We have to assume he knows, Clara, or will know soon enough. And once he does, he'll send men after us. The thought should have terrified her, but instead Clara felt a strange calm settle over her shoulders. Let them come. We've got right on our side, and evidence that will put McCaffrey away for a long time. That's worth fighting for. Fighting? Yes. Dying for? No. Ethan's voice was firm. If it comes to a choice between delivering this evidence and keeping you alive, I choose you. Every time. Clara's breath caught. That's not your choice to make. The hell it isn't. You think I risked everything to help your brother just so I could watch you throw your life away for justice? Justice means nothing if good people die pursuing it. He leaned forward, intensity radiating from him. I meant what I said that first night. You and Luke are my answered prayer, my reason for surviving that blizzard. And I'll be damned if I let Harold McCaffrey take that away from me. The raw honesty in his words left Clara speechless. She'd spent 3 years learning not to depend on anyone, not to trust in promises or protection. But here was this man, this rancher who owed her nothing, declaring that her life mattered more than justice, more than evidence, more than anything. Why? The word came out barely above a whisper. Why do we matter so much to you? Ethan was quiet for a long time, his eyes distant with memory. I told you about my sister Sarah. What I didn't tell you was that she wrote me a letter before she died, Took 3 months to reach me because she didn't know where I was, and by the time I got it, she'd been dead for 2. His jaw tightened. She asked me why I never came looking for her, why I let her face that false accusation alone, why I chose my pride and my ranch over my own blood. You couldn't have known. I could have tried, could have made the effort to stay in touch, to be the kind of brother who'd notice when she went silent. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. So when Luke showed up bleeding and desperate, when you walked into town with that same haunted look Sarah had in her last photograph, I saw my chance to do what I should have done years ago. To stand with family when they needed it most, even if that family wasn't technically mine. Clara's eyes stung with unshed tears. We're not your responsibility, Ethan. We're not your redemption either. Maybe not. But you're my choice, and that's enough. He settled back against his saddle, his voice gentling. Now get some sleep. We've got another hard day tomorrow, and I need you sharp. Clara lay back on her bedroll, staring up at the river of stars overhead. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a promise written in light, and somewhere out there, her father's spirit might be watching, might be proud that his children had finally found an ally worth trusting. She drifted off thinking about Ethan's words, about being someone's answered prayer. And for the first time in 3 years, she slept without nightmares. The second day dawned cold and gray, with clouds building over the mountains and the smell of rain on the wind. They broke camp quickly and pushed north at a steady pace, making good time across terrain that grew progressively rougher. By midday, they'd covered nearly 20 miles, and Ethan declared they were making better progress than he'd hoped. At this rate, we'll reach Helena by tomorrow evening. Marshal Morrison keeps office hours until 7, so if we push hard, we can deliver this evidence tomorrow night and file formal charges first thing the following morning. He pulled out a crude map and traced their route with one finger. There's a trading post about 10 miles ahead, Bergstrom's station. We can stop there for supplies, maybe get information about whether McCaffrey's men have been asking questions. The trading post appeared around 3 that afternoon, a weathered collection of buildings huddled in a valley where 2 trails intersected. Smoke rose from the main building's chimney, and several horses were tied outside. Not unusual for a place that served as a way station for travelers, but enough to make both Clara and Ethan cautious. Let me go in first, Ethan said, dismounting. If there's trouble, you ride out fast and don't look back. Not a chance. Clara swung down from her mare. We're in this together, remember? Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but a faint smile touched his mouth instead. Stubborn woman. You have no idea. They entered the trading post side by side, hands near their weapons but not touching them. The interior was dim and smelled of tobacco smoke and old leather, with shelves stocked haphazardly with goods ranging from ammunition to flour to axes. A heavy-set man with a gray beard stood behind a rough wooden counter, and 3 other men lounged near a pot-bellied stove. Travelers by the look of them, rough and trail-worn, but not immediately threatening. Help you folks? The proprietor's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Need some coffee and hardtack if you've got it, Ethan said easily. Maybe some information about the trail north. We're heading to Helena. Helena's 2 days north, but you probably know that. The man pulled out coffee beans and began measuring them into a cloth sack. Trail's been quiet lately, no trouble to speak of. One of the men by the stove spoke up, his voice carrying an edge Clara didn't like. You folks coming from Blackwater Creek way? Every instinct Clara possessed screamed danger, but she kept her expression neutral. Near there, got a ranch west of town. Funny. The man stood and Clara saw he was tall and lean, with the predatory look of someone who'd spent time on the wrong side of the law. We heard tell of a rancher from that area who's been harboring fugitives. Fella named Walker. You wouldn't happen to know him, would you? Ethan's posture didn't change, but Clara felt the tension rolling off him in waves. I'm Walker, and I don't harbor fugitives. I employ ranch hands who've had some hard luck but are trying to make an honest living. There a problem with that? Depends on what you call hard luck. A second man stood, and Clara realized with sinking dread that these weren't random travelers. They were McCaffrey's men, positioned here to watch for exactly what was happening right now. We heard you've been keeping company with Luke Jennings. That's the name of a man wanted for horse theft. Luke Jennings worked for me briefly, recovered from an injury at my ranch, and moved on. Ethan's voice stayed level, but his hand drifted slightly closer to his gun. I run a clean operation, hire who I please, and don't answer to gossip and speculation. That's real interesting. The third man stood now, and Clara saw with a jolt that he was wearing a deputy's badge, probably one of the men Rutherford had deputized at McCaffrey's request. Because we've got orders to search anyone traveling from that area, making sure stolen property isn't being transported across territorial lines. Clara's heart hammered, but she forced herself to stay calm. The evidence was hidden in Ethan's saddlebag, concealed inside ordinary supplies. As long as they didn't search too thoroughly, as long as they didn't know what they were looking for, the papers might stay hidden. Search away, Ethan said with calculated indifference. But you'll need to show me proper authorization. A badge doesn't give you the right to harass citizens without cause. The deputy's expression darkened. The cause is that Harold McCaffrey swore out a complaint about stolen property, possibly being moved by associates of Luke Jennings. That gives me all the authorization I need. McCaffrey's complaints aren't worth the paper they're written on, Clara said before she could stop herself. Everyone knows he uses his money to push the law around however he wants. The deputy's attention swung to her, and she saw recognition dawn in his eyes. You're the girl, the sister, Clara Jennings. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Clara's skin crawl. Well now, this just got a whole lot more interesting. Everything happened fast after that. The deputy moved toward Clara, hand reaching for his gun, and Ethan was suddenly between them, his own pistol drawn and aimed with the kind of speed that came from years of practice. Don't. The single word carried absolute authority. You draw on her and I'll put a bullet in you before your gun clears leather. The room froze. The other two men had their hands on their weapons but hadn't drawn yet, caught in the terrible mathematics of violence. If they pulled their guns, people would die. And none of them were quite sure they'd be among the survivors. The proprietor spoke up, his voice sharp with commercial concern. Gentlemen, I don't allow gunplay in my establishment. You've got business with each other. Take it outside. Smart man. Ethan kept his gun steady on the deputy. We're leaving now. We'll take our supplies and be on our way, and nobody needs to get hurt. Can't let you do that, the deputy said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. I've got orders to detain you both. Orders from McCaffrey aren't legal orders. You're a deputy, not his personal enforcer. Ethan's voice was hard as iron. So here's what's going to happen. My friend here is going to pay for our supplies. Then we're going to walk out that door, mount our horses, and ride north. You're going to stay in here and count to 100. If you follow us, if you try to stop us, I will defend myself and her with lethal force. Are we clear? Clara moved to the counter, hands shaking as she pulled coins from her pocket and set them down. The proprietor swept them up without a word, clearly wanting this confrontation over and out of his trading post. She grabbed the coffee and hardtack, stuffing them into her saddlebag, while keeping one eye on the standoff behind her. You're making a mistake, Walker, the deputy said. Running just makes you look guilty. I'm not running, I'm traveling. There's a difference. Ethan backed toward the door, gun never wavering. Clara, get on your horse. She slipped outside into the gray afternoon, moving quickly to her mare. The other horses tied outside included 3 that looked suspiciously like McCaffrey ranch stock. Confirmation that these men had been planted here specifically to intercept anyone from Ethan's ranch. It was a smart play, and it meant McCaffrey knew more than they'd hoped. Ethan emerged from the trading post, still covering the door with his gun. He mounted his sorrel in one smooth motion, and they spurred their horses into a gallop, putting distance between themselves and Bergstrom's station as fast as the terrain would allow. They'd gone maybe 2 miles when Clara heard it, the sound of pursuit. Multiple horses, riding hard. She glanced back and saw 4 riders cresting a hill behind them, and her stomach dropped. 4 against 2, in open country, and one of them wearing a deputy's badge that gave him the color of law. Ethan, she pointed back at the pursuers. He'd already seen them. Stay with me and don't stop for anything. We need to reach the forest line ahead. Once we're in the trees, we can lose them. They raced across open ground, the horses stretching into full gallops that ate up distance but couldn't be sustained for long. Clara leaned low over her mare's neck, feeling the powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath her, hearing the thunder of hooves and the whistle of wind in her ears. Behind them, the pursuers were gaining. Their horses were fresher, their riders lighter without heavy saddlebags. The tree line was still a quarter-mile ahead when Clara heard the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The bullet whined past her ear, so close she felt the displacement of air, and terror spiked through her veins like lightning. They were shooting to kill. Another shot. Another miss. But the next one might not miss. Clara pulled her own pistol, twisted in the saddle, and fired back without really aiming, just enough to make the pursuers think twice about getting too close. The motion threw off her balance, and her mare stumbled slightly, losing precious ground. "Clara!" Ethan had seen the stumble. He wheeled his sorrel around, riding back toward her even as the pursuers closed the distance. "No! Keep going!" Clara righted herself, urged her mare forward. "Don't stop for me!" But Ethan wasn't listening. He positioned his horse between Clara and the pursuers, his rifle coming up with deadly intent. He fired once, and one of the pursuing horses screamed and went down, throwing its rider. 3 left, but now they were more cautious, spreading out to make themselves harder targets. The tree line was close now, so close. Clara's mare was laboring, foam flecking her neck, but she kept running with the heart that had carried Clara across half a territory. Just another 100 yards. 50. 25. They crashed into the forest like swimmers breaking the surface after too long underwater, branches whipping past and pine needles showering down. Ethan led them through the trees at a pace that was reckless, bordering on suicidal, trusting his horse to find footing on ground scattered with roots and fallen logs. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew more confused, more distant. After 10 minutes of hard riding through increasingly dense forest, Ethan finally slowed and pulled into a small clearing where a creek provided cover for their sounds. Both horses were blowing hard, sides heaving, and Clara herself was gasping like she'd run the whole distance on foot. "We can't stop long," Ethan said, dismounting to check his horse. "They'll keep searching, and once they realize we're not on the main trail anymore, they'll start combing these woods." "How far to Helena from here if we stay in the forest?" Clara slid from her mare and immediately checked the animal's legs for injury. Nothing broken, thank God, but the mare was exhausted. 30 miles, maybe more, rough terrain all the way. Ethan was studying his map, frowning. "There's an old logging road that runs north through these mountains. It's not maintained, probably half washed out, but it would get us to Helena without going back to the main trail." "Then that's what we do." Clara looked back the way they'd come, listening for sounds of pursuit. "They're not going to stop, are they? McCaffrey's put too much into this chase to give up now." "No, they won't stop, which means we don't stop either." Ethan refolded the map and mounted up. "We ride until dark, then we keep riding by moonlight. We get to Helena, we get to Marshall Morrison, and we end this." They pushed north through forest that grew increasingly wild and untamed. The logging road Ethan had mentioned was barely visible, choked with brush and undermined by weather, but it provided enough of a path to follow. The horses picked their way carefully over treacherous ground while Clara and Ethan maintained constant vigilance for any sign of pursuit. Darkness fell early beneath the forest canopy, and still they rode. The moon rose full and bright, filtering through the trees in silver shafts that provided just enough light to navigate by. Clara's exhaustion was bone-deep now, the kind that made every movement feel like wading through deep water. But she gritted her teeth and kept going, driven by the same desperate determination that had sustained her through 3 years of searching. Sometime after midnight, Ethan finally called a halt in a ravine where the creek ran too loud for anyone to hear them from more than 50 yards away. They didn't risk a fire, just collapsed beside their horses and shared the last of their water and food. "How much further?" Clara asked, her voice rough with fatigue. "If we've been following the right route, maybe 15 miles. We could be in Helena by noon tomorrow." Ethan sounded as exhausted as Clara felt. "Question is whether McCaffrey's men are ahead of us or behind us." "Both, probably. He's got resources, men stationed all over this territory." Clara leaned back against a tree trunk. "Even if we make it to Helena, even if we get this evidence to the marshal, what's to stop McCaffrey from claiming we forged it, or bribing officials, or just disappearing us before we can testify?" "Marshal Morrison is honest. I'd stake my life on that." Ethan's voice was firm, despite his exhaustion. "And once the evidence is in official hands, recorded and witnessed, McCaffrey can't make it disappear without revealing his own guilt. The man's powerful, but he's not invincible. Clara wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because the alternative was accepting that they'd risked everything for nothing, that justice was just a pretty word people used to feel better about a world that ground the powerless into dust. "Tell me about your ranch," she said suddenly, needing to think about something other than danger and death. "When this is over, when we go back, what's it like in winter, in spring?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, as if shifting mental gears. Winter's hard but beautiful. Snow 3 feet deep, everything white and silent. The cattle cluster near the barn, and we spend most of our time making sure they have enough hay to survive until spring. It's isolated. Sometimes we don't see another soul for weeks, but there's something peaceful about it, like the whole world has taken a breath and held it. And spring? Spring is calving season, which means sleepless nights and constant worry, but also new life everywhere you look. The meadows turn green overnight, wildflowers bloom, and the creek runs so high and fast you can hear it from the house. We drive the cattle up to the high pastures and repair all the damage winter did to the fences. His voice softened with affection for the place. "It's good land, Clara, the kind of place where people can build something that lasts. Your family would be proud of what you've built there." "I hope so. I like to think my father would approve. He always said a man should leave the world better than he found it. And my sister," Ethan's voice caught. "Sarah would have loved the ranch, would have loved Mrs. Chen and the garden she keeps, and the way the sun sets over the western mountains." Clara reached out in the darkness and found his hand, squeezed it gently. "She'd be proud of you, for what you're doing now, for who you've become." "I know I am." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. "Clara, when this is over, when Luke is cleared and McCaffrey is behind bars, I want you to know." He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. "I want you to know that you'll always have a place at the Double W, both of you, for as long as you want it." "As hired hands?" Clara's voice was soft, barely audible over the creek. "As family." Ethan turned to look at her, and even in the moonlight she could see the intensity in his eyes. "As whatever you want to be." Because somewhere between lying to the sheriff and pulling you out of that ravine and riding through hell to get to Helena, I stopped thinking of you as someone I was helping and started thinking of you as... He cut himself off, shook his head. "This isn't the time. We should rest while we can." But Clara didn't let go of his hand. "Started thinking of me as what?" "As someone I can't imagine my life without." The words came out rough, honest, stripped of any pretense. "As someone who makes me understand why I survived that blizzard. As, hell, Clara, I don't have pretty words for it. I just know that when you were hanging on that rope and those men were coming closer, all I could think was that I'd rather die than lose you." Clara's breath caught. 3 years of running had taught her not to want anything permanent, not to dream of futures that could be stolen away. But here in the darkness, with Ethan's hand warm in hers, and Helena just hours away, she let herself want anyway. "When this is over," she said quietly, "when we've done what we came to do and we're heading back to the ranch, ask me again. Ask me what I want, where I want to be, and I'll give you an answer. I'll hold you to that." Ethan lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, a gesture so unexpected and tender that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Now, sleep. I'll take first watch." Clara wanted to argue that she should share the watch duty, but exhaustion won out. She curled up on her bedroll with her gun within easy reach and let herself drift off to the sound of the creek and the knowledge that Ethan was watching over her. She woke to his hand on her shoulder and the gray light of pre-dawn. "We need to move. I heard horses about an hour ago south of here. They're searching the forest, getting closer." They saddled up in grim silence and rode north as the sun rose, pushing the tired horses as hard as they dared. The forest began to thin, giving way to more open country, and Clara could see in the distance what looked like buildings. Lots of buildings. Helena, sprawling across a valley like a promise of civilization. "Almost there," Ethan said, and she heard the relief in his voice. "Another hour at most." But an hour was a lifetime when being hunted. They'd gone maybe 3 more miles when Clara spotted movement on a ridge to their left. Riders, at least 6 of them, moving to cut off their approach to town. Ethan, she pointed, and he cursed under his breath. They're trying to force us east, away from Helena. If we go that way, we'll end up in the Badlands where they can corner us. He scanned the terrain with desperate intensity. But if we push straight through to town, we'll have to ride right past them. They'll have a clear shot at us. Then we make ourselves hard targets. Clara checked her ammunition, found she had 5 bullets left in her pistol and maybe a dozen more in her saddlebag. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to make McCaffrey's men think twice. We ride hard and fast, stay low, and we don't stop for anything. You said Marshal Morrison is honest. If we can get to his office, if we can get inside with witnesses around, they can't touch us. Ethan looked at her with something between admiration and fear. You know there's a good chance one of us doesn't make it through this. I know. Clara met his eyes steadily. But I've been running for 3 years, Ethan. I'm done running. We end this today, in Helena, with or without McCaffrey's permission. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face, fierce and proud. Then let's give them hell. They spurred their horses into a gallop, heading straight for town and the riders trying to block their path. The men on the ridge saw them coming and started down the slope, rifles coming up. But Clara and Ethan had momentum and desperation on their side. The first shots cracked out, bullets kicking up dirt around the horses' hooves. Clara fired back, saw one of the riders jerk and fall from his saddle. Ethan's rifle barked twice, and another man went down. But there were still 4 of them, and they were spreading out to create a crossfire that would be impossible to ride through. Helena was so close now, close enough that Clara could see people on the streets stopping to stare at the gunfight, unfolding at the edge of town. She saw men running for the sheriff's office, saw others diving for cover, saw the whole town mobilizing in response to violence. One of McCaffrey's men got close enough that Clara could see his face, the deputy from the trading post, his expression twisted with rage and determination. He aimed his pistol directly at her, and time seemed to slow down. She saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the hammer start to fall, and knew with absolute certainty that this bullet wouldn't miss. Then Ethan was there, his horse slamming into the deputy's mount hard enough to send both animals staggering. The deputy's shot went wild, and Ethan's return fire didn't. The deputy fell backward off his horse and lay still, but the collision had cost them. Ethan's sorrel was limping now, favoring its left foreleg, and the remaining 3 pursuers were closing in from behind. Clara wheeled her mare around, putting herself between the pursuers and Ethan, and fired her last 3 bullets in rapid succession. She didn't know if she hit anyone, didn't have time to check, because suddenly there were new riders coming from town, men wearing official badges, real lawmen responding to the gunfight. "Federal Marshal!" a voice boomed across the open ground. "Drop your weapons, all of you!" The pursuing riders pulled up short, looking uncertain. The man who'd shouted was tall and gray-haired with a marshal's star pinned prominently to his vest, and a rifle pointed with unmistakable authority at McCaffrey's men. "These people are federal witnesses under my protection," the marshal continued, his voice carrying like thunder. "You fire another shot, and I'll see you hanged for attempted murder. Now drop your goddamn guns and get on the ground!" For one terrible moment, Clara thought McCaffrey's men would keep fighting, would decide that killing her and Ethan was worth dying for. But then, one by one, they lowered their weapons and dismounted, hands raised. Clara's mare staggered to a stop just inside the town limits, and she slid from the saddle more falling than dismounting. Ethan was beside her immediately, his hand steadying her even though he looked ready to collapse himself. The gray-haired marshal approached, his expression a mixture of concern and professional assessment. "You folks want to tell me what the hell that was about? And why Harold McCaffrey's men just tried to gun you down in broad daylight outside my town?" Ethan pulled the saddlebag from his injured horse and thrust it toward the marshal. "Because this bag contains evidence proving McCaffrey conspired with a known murderer named Ned Carver, evidence that will clear an innocent man's name and put McCaffrey in prison where he belongs." He swayed slightly, exhausted beyond measure. "I'm Ethan Walker. This is Clara Jennings, and we're here to file formal charges against Harold McCaffrey for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder of federal witnesses." The marshal took the bag, his experienced eyes missing nothing, not the bullet holes in their clothes, not the blood on Ethan's sleeve from a graze Clara hadn't even noticed, not the bone-deep exhaustion that had both of them barely standing. "Morrison," he said, introducing himself. "Jack Morrison, Territorial Marshal. And if half of what you're saying is true, we've got a lot to discuss. He turned to his deputies. Get these people to my office. Get them water and food and a doctor if they need one. And somebody arrest those men. Attempted murder of federal witnesses, just like Mr. Walker said. As McCaffrey's men were being restrained and disarmed, as Clara and Ethan were being ushered into the relative safety of Helena's streets, Clara felt something inside her chest finally release. They'd made it. Against all odds, against McCaffrey's money and influence and hired guns, they'd made it to Helena with the evidence intact. Justice, that elusive dream she'd been chasing for 3 years, was finally within reach. And when she looked at Ethan, battered and bleeding and still standing beside her, she saw in his eyes the same fierce triumph, the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had carried them both through hell and out the other side. "We did it," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "Ethan, we actually did it." "We did it," he agreed and pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. "Now let's finish it." Marshal Morrison's office was a solid building of stone and timber that spoke of permanence and authority. Exactly the kind of place Clara had dreamed of reaching for 3 desperate years. Inside, the marshal spread the contents of the saddlebag across his desk with the careful attention of a man who understood that evidence could mean the difference between justice and tragedy. He examined each document in silence. The employment records showing Ned Carver working under an assumed name, the letter from McCaffrey arranging Carver's fresh start, the bank receipts proving regular payments, and finally, Thomas Jennings's pocket watch with its damning inscription. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "This is substantial, more than substantial. This is enough to bring formal charges against Harold McCaffrey for harboring a known fugitive and conspiracy after the fact." Morrison set down the watch carefully. "But I need to understand the full story. From the beginning." So Clara told it. She spoke of her father's hanging for a murder he didn't commit, of Luke's desperate flight and 3 years searching for him, of Ethan finding her brother bleeding in that ravine with evidence that could finally clear the Jennings name. Ethan filled in details about McCaffrey's attempts to intimidate them, the warrant used to search his ranch, the men planted at Bergstrom Station to intercept anyone traveling to Helena. Morrison listened without interrupting, taking notes in a careful hand. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied them both with the assessing gaze of someone who'd heard countless stories and learned to separate truth from fabrication. "Miss Jennings, your father was hanged in Nebraska Territory 3 years ago. That's outside my jurisdiction." He held up a hand as Clara's heart sank. "However, if Ned Carver committed that murder and Harold McCaffrey knowingly helped him evade justice, that's a federal offense. Interstate flight from justice, conspiracy, and given that Carver is now dead in what you believe was an intentional fire, we might be looking at murder charges as well." "Can you arrest McCaffrey?" Ethan asked, "before he finds out we're here and tries to flee or destroy more evidence?" "I can and I will, but I need to do this right, by the book, so it sticks." Morrison stood and moved to his door, calling for his deputies. "I'm going to send riders to Blackwater Creek right now. One to arrest McCaffrey, another to bring your brother here safely to give his testimony. Meanwhile, you two are going to write out formal statements, every detail, every date you can remember, every witness who can corroborate your story." Over the next hours, Clara wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes burned with fatigue. She documented everything from the night her father was arrested to the moment they'd ridden into Helena under gunfire. Ethan did the same at an adjacent desk, their accounts separate but corroborating, building a case that would be nearly impossible to dismiss. By evening, Morrison had assembled a formidable packet of evidence and testimony. He stood before them with satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "This is good work, solid work. When Judge Anderson sees this, there won't be any question about issuing arrest warrants." "How long before McCaffrey's in custody?" Clara asked. "My men left for Blackwater Creek 4 hours ago. It's a hard day's ride, so figure they'll arrive around midnight, make the arrest, and be back here by tomorrow evening." Morrison's expression turned sympathetic. "I know waiting is hard, but we need to let the law work the way it's supposed to. No vigilante justice, no taking matters into your own hands. Can you promise me that?" "We promise," Ethan said, and Clara nodded her agreement, even though every instinct screamed at her to ride back to Blackwater Creek herself and watch McCaffrey get what he deserved. Morrison arranged rooms for them at Helena's best hotel, the Territorial House, with his own deputies stationed outside as protection. Clara found herself in a room with an actual bed, clean sheets, and a copper bathtub that felt like unimaginable luxury. She soaked away days of trail dust and fear, letting hot water work out the knots in her shoulders and back. When she emerged, wrapped in a borrowed robe with her hair hanging wet down her back, she found Ethan waiting in the hallway. He'd cleaned up too, shaved and changed into fresh clothes that made him look less like a hunted man and more like the successful rancher he actually was. But exhaustion still shadowed his eyes, and the bandage on his arm where a bullet had grazed him showed white against his sleeve. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Can't stop thinking about Luke, about what's happening at the ranch while we're here safe in Helena." Clara wrapped her arms around herself. What if McCaffrey sent men there? What if he's trying to kill Luke before the marshal's riders arrive? Miguel and Tom won't let anything happen to him, and Mrs. Chen would fight off an army if she had to. Ethan smiled slightly. "Your brother's safer than we were on that ride here. Trust in that." Trust. Clara tested the word like it was something foreign. "I've spent 3 years learning not to trust anything or anyone. And now you're asking me to trust that justice will actually happen, that McCaffrey will actually pay for what he's done. I'm asking you to trust that you've done everything you can, that the evidence we brought is enough, that sometimes, Clara, the good guys actually win." Ethan moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "And I'm asking you to trust me when I say I won't let McCaffrey hurt you or your brother. Not now, not ever." Clara looked up at him, at this man who'd lied to a sheriff for a stranger, who'd hidden her fugitive brother for 6 weeks, who'd ridden through hell to help her deliver evidence that wasn't even his burden to carry. She thought about the question he'd asked her in that forest clearing. What did she want? Where did she want to be? Ethan. His name came out soft, almost tentative. "When you asked me what I wanted after this was over, you said to ask you again when we got back to the ranch." His voice was equally soft. "When everything was settled and safe. I don't want to wait that long." Clara reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of newly shaved skin and the warmth of living flesh. "I've spent 3 years waiting for justice, waiting for Luke, waiting for some sign that life could be more than just survival. I'm tired of waiting." Ethan's hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm against his cheek. "Clara, you've been through hell. You're exhausted, running on nothing but determination and coffee. Maybe you should—" "Don't tell me what I should do." But there was no anger in her voice, just fierce certainty. "I'm telling you what I want. I want to stop running. I want to build something that lasts. I want—" She took a breath, let herself say what she'd been afraid to even think. "I want what you offered me, a place at the Double W, a home, a future that doesn't involve looking over my shoulder waiting for the next disaster." "And what about me?" Ethan's voice was rough with emotion. "Where do I fit in this future you're imagining?" "Right in the center of it." Clara's other hand came up to frame his face, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. "If you'll have me. If you meant what you said about not being able to imagine your life without me." "I meant every word." Ethan's arms went around her waist, pulling her close. "Claire Jennings, you rode into my life like a summer storm and turned everything upside down. You're brave and stubborn and fierce, and somewhere between lying to that sheriff and pulling you out of that ravine, I fell completely in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying, and absolutely right. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally, finding something good in a world that had taken so much from her. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling that first day, when you stepped forward and lied for me when you had no reason to. When you showed me that good men still existed in the world." Ethan kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It wasn't the desperate kiss of people who thought they might die tomorrow. It was the kiss of people who'd fought their way through darkness and found light on the other side, who'd earned their happy ending through blood and determination and stubborn refusal to surrender. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and smiling, Clara rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. Outside the window, Helena's streets were settling into evening quiet, and somewhere to the south, Justice was riding toward Blackwater Creek with arrest warrants and the full authority of territorial law. "We should get some rest," Ethan said, though he made no move to let her go. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Tomorrow McCaffrey gets arrested. Tomorrow Luke arrives safely. Tomorrow we start rebuilding our lives." Clara pulled back enough to look at him. "But tonight, I just want to stay here with you and believe that everything's going to be all right. It is going to be all right." Ethan's conviction was absolute. "I promise you that." They stood in that hallway until the hotel lamps were dimmed and the night grew deep around them. Two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and discovered something worth fighting for. When they finally parted to their separate rooms, it was with the knowledge that nothing would separate them again. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Clara slept that night without nightmares, without fear, with only the memory of Ethan's arms around her and his promise that tomorrow would be better than today. The next day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Morrison kept them updated as telegrams arrived from his deputies. McCaffrey had been arrested without incident around 2 in the morning, was currently being transported to Helena in irons. Luke had been found safe at the ranch, with Miguel and Tom standing guard, was being escorted north by a separate group of deputies. Both parties expected to arrive by late afternoon. Clara paced the hotel room like a caged animal, unable to settle, unable to stop imagining everything that could still go wrong. Ethan finally dragged her out for a walk through Helena's streets, pointing out landmarks and shops, and trying to distract her with mundane conversation. It helped, a little, enough that by the time they returned to the marshal's office around 4 o'clock, Clara had managed to regain some measure of calm. Then she saw the commotion in the street, a group of riders approaching from the south, and in the middle of them, shackled and furious, sat Harold McCaffrey. The rancher had lost all his polished veneer. His expensive clothes were rumpled and dusty. His face was bruised where he'd apparently resisted arrest, and his eyes burned with a hatred so intense it was almost physical. When he saw Clara and Ethan standing outside the marshal's office, his expression twisted into something ugly. "You think you've won?" he shouted as the deputies dismounted and prepared to escort him inside. "You think this changes anything? I've got lawyers, judges in my pocket, influence you can't even imagine. I'll be out before sunset and you'll be silent." Marshal Morrison's voice cut across McCaffrey's tirade like a whip. "Or I'll have you gagged, your choice." McCaffrey subsided into sullen silence as he was marched into the building, but his eyes promised violence and vengeance. Clara felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm afternoon sun. Even in chains, even facing justice, the man was dangerous. "Don't let him rattle you," Ethan said quietly. "He's got nothing now but empty threats. The evidence is solid, the charges are filed, and his influence doesn't extend to territorial courts." Clara wanted to believe him, but 3 years of disappointment had taught her to expect the worst. She'd seen powerful men escape justice before, had watched her father hang while his real killer walked free. She wouldn't believe McCaffrey was truly beaten until she saw him sentenced and locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone else. An hour later, the second group of riders arrived, and Clara's heart leaped when she saw Luke among them. Her brother looked thin and pale but alive and healing, sitting his horse with growing strength. The moment he dismounted, Clara was there, throwing her arms around him with such force they both nearly fell over. "Easy, easy," Luke laughed, wincing as his shoulder protested the enthusiasm. "I'm still put together with stitches and prayers." "You're here. You're safe." Clara pulled back to look at him properly. "God, Luke, I was so worried." "Worried about me? I'm not the one who rode into a gunfight and barely made it to Helena alive." Luke's eyes were wet as he looked between Clara and Ethan. "Miguel told me everything. What you did, what you risked. Clara, you could have died." "But I didn't. We didn't." Clara grabbed his hand. "And now McCaffrey's under arrest and we've got enough evidence to clear your name and Pa's name and finally end this nightmare." Luke's expression shifted to something fierce and hungry. "He's here? McCaffrey's actually here?" Inside with Marshal Morrison. Ethan moved to Luke's other side. And you're about to give your formal testimony. Everything you saw, everything you found, everything that happened. Are you ready for that? I've been ready for 3 years. Luke straightened his shoulders despite the obvious pain it caused. Let's finish this. Marshal Morrison took Luke's statement with the same careful attention he'd given Claire and Ethan. Luke described tracking Ned Carver to Wyoming, confronting him about the murder, following him back to Montana, and being shot and left for dead when Carver realized he was being pursued. He identified the pocket watch as belonging to their father, confirmed the dates and details in the employment records, and testified under oath that Harold McCaffrey's letter proved the rancher had knowingly helped a fugitive from justice. When it was done, Morrison set down his pen and looked at the three of them with something like respect. This is one of the most thoroughly documented cases I've seen in 20 years as a marshal. You've built an ironclad case against McCaffrey. The territorial prosecutor will have no trouble getting a conviction. When's the trial? Clara asked. Judge Anderson is in Helena right now for the circuit court session. I can get this on his docket within the week. He doesn't take kindly to powerful men abusing their position. Morrison stood and offered his hand first to Luke, then to Ethan and Clara. You've done good work here, all three of you. Your father would be proud. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years trying to honor her father's memory, trying to prove he'd been innocent, trying to clear the family name. And now, finally, it was happening. Justice was no longer a dream, but an approaching reality. That evening, Morrison arranged for them to stay another night at the Territorial House while he prepared the case for presentation to Judge Anderson. Clara, Luke, and Ethan shared dinner in the hotel's dining room, a proper meal with fresh bread and roasted meat and vegetables that hadn't come from a saddlebag. Luke ate like he was making up for 6 weeks of invalid food, and his color improved visibly with every bite. So what happens now? Luke asked between mouthfuls. After the trial, after McCaffrey's convicted, what then? Then you're a free man, Ethan said. The charges against you for horse theft will be dropped once the judge understands you took that stallion as evidence of McCaffrey's crimes. Your father's name gets cleared in the Nebraska records, and you and Clara can finally stop running. And do what? Luke looked at his sister. Clara, I know you've been searching for me all this time, but what about your life? What do you want? Clara glanced at Ethan, saw the slight smile on his face, and felt warmth bloom in her chest. I want what I told Ethan last night, a home, a future, maybe a ranch where good people can build something that lasts. Luke's eyes moved between them and understanding dawned on his face. You two, He stopped, then laughed. Of course you are. I should have seen it coming the minute he lied to that sheriff for you. He reached across the table and gripped Ethan's hand. You take care of my sister. She's been taking care of me for 3 years. It's about time someone took care of her. I intend to, Ethan said seriously, for as long as she'll let me. And me? Luke's voice turned uncertain. Where do I fit in this future you're building? Right beside us, Clara said firmly. The Double W is big enough for 3. You can work as foreman. Miguel's been doing it while you healed, but he'd be happy to have help. Or you can claim your own land nearby, start your own ranch. Whatever you want, Luke, but you'll always have a home with us. Luke's eyes were bright with unshed tears. A home. God, I can't even remember what that feels like. Then it's time you learned. Ethan lifted his glass. To new beginnings. To justice. And to family, blood or chosen. They drank to that. 3 people who'd been broken by the world and found each other in its wreckage. Outside the window, Helena's streets were alive with evening activity, and somewhere in the marshal's lockup, Harold McCaffrey sat in a cell contemplating his fall from power. The world was finally starting to set itself right. The trial began 5 days later in the Territorial Courthouse, an imposing building that represented everything Clara had been fighting for: law, order, justice, administered fairly regardless of wealth or influence. Judge Anderson was a stern man in his 60s who listened to testimony with fierce concentration and tolerated no nonsense from either side. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically. They showed the employment records proving Carver had worked for McCaffrey under a false name. They presented McCaffrey's letter arranging Carver's fresh start. They brought in the bank receipts showing regular payments. They called witnesses who testified that McCaffrey had been seen with Carver multiple times, had vouched for him when seeking employment, had gone out of his way to protect the man. And finally, they called Clara, Luke, and Ethan to testify about what they'd found, what they'd endured, and what it had cost them. Clara took the stand with her father's pocket watch clutched in her hand. She described watching him hang for a crime he didn't commit, described 3 years of searching for justice, described finding evidence in that ravine that proved McCaffrey had knowingly harbored her father's real killer. Her voice never wavered, never broke, though tears streamed down her face as she spoke. Luke testified about confronting Carver, about being shot and left for dead, about the kindness of strangers who'd given him sanctuary when the law had failed him. His voice was stronger than Clara expected, carrying across the courtroom with the force of righteous anger. And Ethan testified about finding Luke, about standing up to McCaffrey's intimidation, about risking everything to help 2 people he barely knew because it was the right thing to do. His quiet integrity was powerful, and Clara saw several jurors nodding in approval as he spoke. McCaffrey's defense was weak and transparent. His lawyers argued that he'd been deceived by Carver, that he'd had no knowledge of any murder, that he was simply a successful rancher who tried to help a man down on his luck. But the evidence was too strong, too thoroughly documented, and when the prosecution revealed that the bunkhouse fire that killed Carver and 3 other men had been deliberately set, with evidence that McCaffrey had been seen near the building that night, even his expensive lawyers couldn't salvage his defense. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict with solemn clarity. We find the defendant, Harold McCaffrey, guilty on all charges: conspiracy to harbor a fugitive from justice, obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact to murder, and 4 counts of murder in the deaths of Ned Carver and 3 employees killed in the deliberate fire at the bunkhouse. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped, and McCaffrey himself surged to his feet with a roar of rage before bailiffs forced him back down. Judge Anderson gavelled for silence, his expression stern. Harold McCaffrey, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of crimes that strike at the very heart of justice. You used your wealth and influence to pervert the law, to protect a murderer, and ultimately to commit murder yourself to cover your crimes. Anderson's voice was cold with condemnation. I hereby sentence you to hang by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out 30 days from today. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. Clara felt Luke's hand grip hers so tightly it hurt. On her other side, Ethan's arm went around her shoulders, steadying her as the full weight of victory crashed over her like a wave. They'd won. After 3 years of fighting and running and hoping against hope, they'd actually won. McCaffrey was still shouting as bailiffs dragged him from the courtroom, threatening lawsuits and appeals and vengeance. But his threats rang hollow now, the desperate cries of a man who'd finally met justice and found it merciless. After the courtroom cleared, Judge Anderson called Clara, Luke, and Ethan into his chambers. He poured them each a measure of whiskey and raised his own glass. What you 3 did took courage I rarely see. You stood up to a powerful man. You followed the law even when it would have been easier to take justice into your own hands, and you never gave up. He drank, then set down his glass. I'm also issuing an official pardon for Luke Jennings regarding the horse theft charge. Given the circumstances, I'm ruling that he took that animal as evidence rather than for personal gain. His record is cleared. Luke's voice was rough with emotion. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for believing us. I didn't just believe you, I believed in you. There's a difference. Anderson turned to Clara. Miss Jennings, I'm also issuing an official posthumous exoneration for your father, Thomas Jennings. Nebraska Territory will be notified that he was innocent of all charges and was wrongfully executed. It won't bring him back, but perhaps it will give you some peace. Clara couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, but the reality was so much more than she'd hoped for. Her father's name was cleared. Luke was free. Justice had been served. They left the courthouse together, stepping out into brilliant autumn sunshine. Word of the verdict had spread through Helena, and people lined the street to cheer as they emerged. Clara saw children waving, saw women dabbing at tears, saw men removing their hats in respect. The The story of the Jennings siblings who'd fought for justice and won had captured Helena's imagination, and now the whole town wanted to celebrate their victory. A telegram waited at the marshal's office from Mrs. Chen, Miguel, and Tom at the W Ranch. "Congratulations. Come home soon. We miss you." Clara read it 3 times, savoring the word home like it was something precious and rare. "Ready to go back?" Ethan asked softly. "Ready to start that future we talked about?" Clara looked at her brother, saw him standing tall and proud and free for the first time in 3 years. She looked at Ethan, saw the man who'd saved them both, and become so much more than just an ally. And she looked at herself, at Clara Jennings, who'd been called trouble her whole life, but had found a cowboy who called her his answered prayer. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's go home." They rode out of Helena 3 days later after purchasing supplies and resting the horses. The journey back to Blackwater Creek was nothing like the desperate flight north had been. They traveled on main roads in full daylight, stopping at trading posts in small towns where news of McCaffrey's trial had already spread. People offered them free meals and lodging, wanting to hear the story firsthand, wanting to touch the people who'd brought down a tyrant. Luke grew stronger with each day of travel, the color returning to his face and the weight starting to come back to his frame. He and Ethan talked for hours about ranching, about cattle breeding and water rights and the best way to prepare for winter. Clara watched them become friends, watched her brother find in Ethan the kind of steady, reliable presence he'd needed since their father died. And she watched Ethan memorizing the way he sat his horse, and the sound of his laugh, and the way his eyes sought her out across the campfire every evening. They didn't speak much about the future in concrete terms. There'd be time for that when they got back to the ranch. But the unspoken promise hung between them like a benediction, warming Clara even on the coldest nights. They reached the W on an afternoon when the aspens were just starting to turn gold and the air carried the first hint of winter. Mrs. Chen saw them coming and ran out of the house with tears streaming down her face, pulling Luke into a fierce embrace and then doing the same to Clara and Ethan. Miguel and Tom emerged from the barn with Duke the dog bounding between them, everyone talking at once, everyone celebrating. That night, they gathered around the kitchen table for a feast Mrs. Chen had been preparing since she'd received word they were coming home. There was roasted beef and fresh bread and vegetables from the garden, and afterward apple pie made from the last of the season's harvest. They ate and laughed and told stories, the house filled with warmth and light and the sound of family. Later, after everyone else had gone to bed, Clara found Ethan on the porch, watching stars emerge in the clear night sky. She joined him there, settling into the space beside him that felt like it had been waiting for her all along. "This is what you promised me," she said quietly. "That night in the ravine when you said we'd finish this and I'd get my life back. This is it, isn't it? The peace that comes after the storm. It's the beginning of it anyway." Ethan turned to face her, his expression serious. "Clara, I told you I'd ask again when we got back to the ranch. When everything was settled and you'd had time to think about what you really wanted." He took her hands in his. "So I'm asking now, will you stay? Not just as a hired hand or a guest, but as my partner in every sense of the word? Will you help me build this ranch into something even better? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were never trouble, that you were my reason to stay, my answered prayer, my everything?" Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, but these were good tears. Happy tears. The kind that came from joy too big to contain. "Yes. To all of it, yes. I'll stay, I'll build with you, I'll be your partner and your family and whatever else you need me to be." She laughed through her tears. "You saved my life, Ethan Walker, and then you gave me a reason to want to live it." He kissed her then, deep and sweet and full of promise, while above them stars wheeled in their ancient patterns and the ranch settled into peaceful silence. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers and spoke in a voice rough with emotion. "I know we should probably wait. Court you properly, let some time pass, do this the traditional way. But Clara, I've never been good at waiting for things I know are right, so I'm going to ask you something, and you can say no if it's too fast, if you need more time. Ask me." Clara's heart was racing, but with excitement rather than fear. Ethan pulled back slightly and dropped to one knee right there on the porch, still holding her hands in his. Clara Jennings, will you marry me? Will you let me stand beside you for the rest of our lives, through whatever storms come and whatever blessings follow? Will you be my wife? The word yes was out of Clara's mouth before he'd even finished asking. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Ethan surged to his feet and lifted her off the ground, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, he pulled a ring from his pocket, simple gold with a small diamond that caught the starlight. It was my grandmother's, he said as he slipped it onto her finger. The only thing of value my father left me when he died. I've been carrying it with me since the day after you arrived, hoping I'd get the chance to give it to you. Clara stared at the ring through tears, overwhelmed by the symbolism of it. This man who'd lost his own family, giving her the most precious piece of what remained, joining his history with hers, choosing to build a future together from the wreckage of their pasts. The door opened behind them, and Luke stepped out, took one look at Clara's tear-stained face and the ring on her finger, and broke into a grin. About damn time. I was starting to wonder if I'd have to lock you two in a barn together. Mrs. Chen appeared behind him, saw the ring, and immediately started crying happy tears while pulling them all into a group embrace. Miguel and Tom emerged, summoned by the commotion, and someone produced a bottle of whiskey that had been saved for special occasions. They stood on that porch together, Clara and Ethan, Luke and Mrs. Chen, Miguel and Tom, and even Duke the dog, and celebrated not just an engagement, but everything it represented: victory over injustice, family forged through adversity, hope reclaimed from despair, and love found in the most unexpected of places. A month later, they were married in Blackwater Creek's small church with half the town in attendance. The same people who'd once whispered trouble when Clara rode through now filled the pews to witness her happiness. Sheriff Rutherford gave her away in place of her father, tears in his eyes as he placed her hand in Ethan's. Judge Anderson traveled from Helena to perform the ceremony, declaring that he wanted to see the end of this particular story for himself. Clara wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had sewn with loving care, with wildflowers in her hair, and her father's pocket watch tucked in her bodice over her heart. Luke stood as best man, healthy and strong and free, his testimony during the trial having earned him respect throughout the territory. And Ethan stood waiting at the altar in his best suit, looking at Clara like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever spoken. When Judge Anderson pronounced them husband and wife, and Ethan kissed her in front of everyone, the church erupted in cheers. People threw rice and flower petals as they emerged into autumn sunshine, and someone had decorated a wagon with ribbons and bells to carry them back to the ranch. The reception was held in the Double W's barn, which had been transformed with lanterns and bunting and long tables laden with food. People came from neighboring ranches and from town, all wanting to celebrate with the couple who'd fought for justice and won. There was music and dancing and toasts that went on until the stars came out. Clara danced with her new husband, with her brother, with Miguel and Tom, and even Sheriff Rutherford. But her favorite moment came late in the evening when the crowd had thinned and Ethan pulled her aside to the porch where he'd first proposed. "Happy?" he asked, though the answer was written all over her face. "Happier than I knew was possible." Clara leaned against him, watching the last guest depart and the lanterns flicker in the gentle breeze. "A year ago, I was sleeping in a ravine outside some nameless town, convinced I'd never find Luke, never clear my father's name, never have anything resembling a normal life, and now," she gestured at the scene before them, the ranch, the people, the life they'd built. "Now I have everything." "We have everything," Ethan corrected, "and we're going to keep building it, together." They stood there as the night deepened and the last sounds of celebration faded. Two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and created the best of outcomes. The town had called Clara trouble, but her cowboy had called her his answered prayer. And in the end, he'd been right. Because sometimes prayers get answered in ways nobody expects. Sometimes justice actually prevails. And sometimes, in the wild territory of Montana, where the law was still being written and futures were still being forged, a woman running from her past could find a man willing to help her build a future worth staying for. The Double W Ranch thrived in the years that followed. Luke claimed land adjacent to Ethan's and built his own small ranch with help from his brother-in-law and the hands who'd become friends. Mrs. Chen stayed on as housekeeper and surrogate mother to them all, eventually convinced to bring her daughter from San Francisco to live at the ranch and help manage the growing household. Clara and Ethan's first child was born 2 years after their wedding, a daughter with her mother's red hair and her father's blue eyes, who they named Sarah in honor of the sister Ethan had lost. Luke was her devoted uncle, spoiling her shamelessly and teaching her to ride almost before she could walk. They expanded the ranch gradually, buying adjacent properties when they became available, always treating their workers fairly and building a reputation as one of the most honest operations in the territory. People said you could trust a deal made with the Walkers, that their word was as good as gold, that they ran their ranch the way ranches should be run, with integrity and kindness and respect for everyone who worked there. And sometimes, when travelers passed through Blackwater Creek and asked about the successful rancher and his red-haired wife, the old-timers would tell the story. How she'd been called trouble when she first rode into town, how he'd lied to save her and ended up falling in love, how together they'd brought down a corrupt rancher and cleared an innocent man's name. How sometimes, on the frontier where justice was hard-won and love was harder, good people could still prevail. The town that had once judged Clara now pointed to her with pride. "That's Mrs. Walker," they'd say to newcomers. "The woman who changed Blackwater Creek, the one who proved that sometimes the people everyone calls trouble are just people who've had more than their share of it." And every night, when the work was done and the children were asleep and the ranch settled into peaceful silence, Ethan would hold Clara close and whisper the same words that had started everything. "You were never trouble, sweetheart. You were my reason to stay." And Clara, wrapped in the arms of the man who'd seen past her reputation to the woman beneath, who'd fought beside her and believed in her and loved her through it all, would smile and whisper back the truth that had taken her 3 desperate years to find. "And you were my answered prayer." In the end, that was all that mattered. Not what the town had called her or what the past had tried to make her. Just this, a home, a family, a love that had been forged in fire and emerged stronger than steel. Just this moment, and all the moments still to come, built on the foundation of 2 people who'd refused to surrender even when surrender would have been easier. They called her trouble once, but her cowboy knew better. He always had. The end.